Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where survival isn't guaranteed past breakfast, where your home doubles as a barn, and where the very land beneath your feet conspires to freeze, burn, or swallow you whole. Picture yourself waking in complete darkness, wrapped in scratchy wool that reeks of lanolin and sweat, while ice crystals form on the inside of your turf walls. You hear sheep bleating 3 feet from your head, smell the acrid smoke from a dung fire that never quite goes out, and realise with creeping dread that you've somehow been transported to Viking Age Iceland, roughly 930 CE, when this remote island was still a brutal experiment in Norse settlement. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why Icelanders developed such elaborate storytelling traditions, or how anyone survived in a place where trees barely grew and winter darkness swallowed 4/5 of the day. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from, or perhaps share what you think you'd miss most about modern life if you woke up in Viking Iceland tomorrow. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Your eyes adjust slowly to the gloom, and you become aware of the weight pressing down on your chest, not anxiety. Though you'll have plenty of that soon enough, but an actual sheepskin blanket that feels like it weighs 40 pounds and carries the distinctive perfume of wet dog mixed with wood smoke. The longhouse around you is essentially a sophisticated cave, its thick walls constructed from blocks of turf stacked like giant grassy bricks, with a timber frame preventing the whole structure from collapsing inward. You're lying on a raised platform along the wall, what the Vikings called a set, basically a bed shelf built into the architecture itself. Someone nearby is already stirring, and you hear the scrape of shoes on the packed earth floor. There's no window to check the time glasses, a luxury reserved for tiny decorative beads, not something you'd waste on letting cold air find another way inside. Instead, you gauge the hour by the quality of darkness and the activity level of the household. The central long fire, a narrow trench running down the middle of the house's main hall, glows with embers that probably haven't gone completely cold in months. Keeping that fire alive is literally a matter of life and death, because relighting it means precious effort with a fire, steel and tinder. And in winter, failure could mean freezing before you manage to strike a proper spark. You swing your legs off the sleeping platform, and your feet meet the floor with a shock of cold that races up your calves. The ground is hard-packed earth mixed with old rushes, animal droppings, and food scraps that have been trampled into a kind of organic concrete. Modern archaeologists love these floors because they preserve everything in layers, like a disgusting historical lasagna, but living on top of one means you're constantly walking on the composting remains of meals, accidents, and time itself. You can actually feel small bones and gods know what else under your feet. The air quality would fail every modern health inspection ever conceived. Smoke from the long fire has nowhere to go except up toward the roof, where it eventually finds its way out through a hole that also lets in rain, snow, and the occasional bird. This means you're breathing a perpetual haze of wood smoke, or more accurately, dung smoke, because trees are so scarce in Iceland that dried sheep and cow manure becomes the primary fuel. Your lungs already feel coated in a fine layer of particulate matter, and you've been awake for maybe 2 minutes. Historians still argue whether the constant smoke exposure led to shorter lifespans, but Viking-age skeletons often show signs of respiratory diseases that suggest the answer is a definitive yes. A woman brushes past you in the darkness. You can barely make out her shape. Just a movement of slightly less dark against dark, carrying what sounds like a wooden bucket. She's heading toward the byre section, the part of the longhouse where the livestock spend the winter. Yes, You read that the cows, sheep, and horses live under the same roof as you, separated by nothing more than a low partition wall. The logic is actually sound. In a grim, practical way, animal body heat helps warm the house. And during the worst winter storms, bringing the livestock inside means they don't freeze to death and take your food supply with them. The downside is that you're sharing your bedroom with creatures that have no concept of bathroom etiquette. You hear the sound that you'll come to dread, the splatter of fresh manure hitting the floor, followed by the woman's resigned sigh. She'll shovel it later, pile it outside to dry, and eventually you'll be burning it for warmth. The circle of life in Viking Iceland is less Elton John and more everything becomes either food, fuel, or fertilizer, and sometimes all three. You make a mental note never to think too hard about the smoke you're breathing. The reality of your situation starts to settle in, like the cold seeping through the walls. You're not just visiting Viking Iceland, you're stuck here, in the early 10th century, on an island that sits just below the Arctic Circle, where the growing season lasts maybe 3 months if you're lucky, and where the very concept of surviving a day means navigating a minefield of dangers that modern humans have completely forgotten how to recognize. Your smartphone is useless. Your knowledge of history might help you anticipate what's coming, but it won't teach your hands how to card wool, your stomach how to digest rotten shark, or your social instincts how to navigate a culture where insults must be answered with blood or shame. Outside, you hear wind howling across the landscape, carrying with it the salt spray from the North Atlantic and possibly the scent of volcanic sulphur from one of the island's 30-some active volcanic systems. Iceland is geologically infant, still being born from the mid-Atlantic ridge, and the Vikings who settled here quickly learned that their new home was actively hostile. Earthquakes, eruptions, glacial floods, and weather that could turn deadly in minutes. These weren't occasional disasters, but regular features of existence. Someone has started moving around the long fire, adding fuel and coaxing it back to life. Flames begin to lick upward, and suddenly you can see the interior of your new home in flickering orange light. The longhouse is longer than it is wide, maybe 60 feet from end to end, but only 15 feet across, with walls that curve slightly inward as they rise, giving the whole space a hull-like quality, as if you're sleeping inside an upturned ship, which, in a sense, your Viking builders used the same techniques for both boats and buildings, and the same eye for craft that created dragon ships also shaped these turf fortresses against the north. You notice details now, tools hanging from pegs driven into the timber frame, including axes, sickles, and what looks disturbingly like a weapon or two. Woven tapestries hang on some sections of wall, not for decoration but for insulation, creating a tiny buffer of air between you and the frozen turf beyond. The ceiling is low enough that the tallest men probably have to duck in places, and you can see smoke stains darkening the wood overhead, years of fires creating a lacquer of soot. The quirky truth is that some longhouses were actually quite colourful Vikings, sometimes painted the wood trim in reds and yellows, and those tapestries might feature elaborate scenes from mythology or family history. But in the dim firelight of dawn, everything looks muted, shadowy, hovering between the romantic past and the harsh reality of trying not to die of exposure, starvation, or any of the dozen other threats waiting just beyond these turf walls. Your first day in Viking Iceland has begun, and you haven't even made a breakfast yet. Already, you're cold, disoriented, and breathing air that would probably show up as hazardous on any modern sensor. The sheep in the byre let out a particularly loud bleat, as if laughing at your predicament, and somewhere in the darkness, you hear children beginning to stir. The household is waking up, which means the real work and the real dangers are about to begin. You stand up fully now, careful not to crack your head on the low beam running above your sleeping platform, and take in the full scope of your living quarters in the growing firelight. The longhouse that seemed merely dim and smoky a moment ago reveals itself as a masterpiece of cramped medieval engineering, where every square foot serves multiple purposes and privacy as a concept that died somewhere on the voyage from Norway. Your sleeping platform, which felt reasonably private in the darkness, is actually one of several built into the walls, separated from your neighbours by nothing more than wooden posts and maybe a curtain if the family is particularly well off. The person who slept 3 feet to your left is now sitting up, running fingers through tangled hair, and you realise with a start that you have no idea who they are. Cousin Thrall, distant relation claiming hospitality rights in a Viking age household. The sleeping arrangements reflect a complex social hierarchy that you're hopelessly unequipped to navigate. The family patriarch and his wife get the best spot, probably the platform at the far end near the high seat, while everyone else arranges themselves in descending order of importance. You, as a confused time traveller with no discernible skills, would likely end up near the door, the coldest, draftiest position, possibly next to the thralls. The central longfire provides the only heat source for the entire structure, and you can already feel the temperature gradient. It's almost warm if you stand directly over the flames, but venture 10 feet toward either wall, and you're back in territory where your breath mists in the air. The fire trench itself is about 3 feet wide and runs for perhaps 20 feet down the centre of the main hall, lined with stones to keep it from spreading into the earthen floor. On either side, people are careful to step over it, a dance everyone learns in childhood, but which you'll probably mess up spectacularly at least once today, earning yourself a burned foot and the household's contempt. Historians still argue whether longhouses had any kind of chimney system beyond the simple roof hole, with some evidence suggesting more elaborate smoke vents in wealthier homes, but the consensus is that most Icelanders just lived with constant smoke. Your eyes are already watering, and you find yourself instinctively crouching lower where the air is clearer, which is exactly what the Vikings did, designing their living platforms and seats at heights where smoke damage was minimized. The high seat posts, those ornately carved pillars that marked the master's position, rose just high enough to keep his head above the worst of it, while still allowing him to see everyone in the hall. The livestock section at the far end of the house is stirring now, and the sounds are biblical lowing cattle, bleating sheep, possibly a horse nickering. The smell that wafts towards you is profound, a rich mixture of manure, wet wool, hay, and animal musk that would clear a modern room in seconds. But here's the quirky part: Vikings actually believed this arrangement was healthier. The animal's breath added humidity to the desperately dry air heated by the fire. Their body heat genuinely did warm the structure, and keeping them close meant you could monitor valuable livestock for illness or birthing complications. A cow in Viking Iceland wasn't just an animal, it was a walking dairy factory worth more than some thralls. And losing one to winter cold or illness could mean malnutrition for the entire household. You noticed children emerging from sleeping nooks you hadn't even seen in the darkness, small bodies unfolding from what looked like storage chests, or simply piles of wool in corners. A typical longhouse might contain 15 to 20 people across 3 generations, all sleeping within arm's reach of each other, all hearing each other's nighttime sounds, arguments, intimate moments, and dreams. The concept of a private bedroom is about 1,000 years away from being invented for common people. Even the partition walls that divide the longhouse into rooms, the stoffa or main hall, the sleeping areas, the storage rooms, the byre are often just waist-high or made of fabric, creating visual privacy but doing nothing for sound. The woman you saw earlier returns from the byre carrying a bucket of fresh milk, still warm and steaming slightly in the cold air. She moves with the efficient grace of someone who's made this journey thousands of times. navigating around the fire, past sleeping platforms, between storage chests without spilling a drop. You try to move aside to let her pass and immediately trip over something a loom weight, maybe, or a spinning whirl, one of the countless tools that litter the floor because there's simply nowhere else to put them. She shoots you a look that needs no translation. You're in the way, and you're useless. Storage is a three-dimensional puzzle in the longhouse. The walls are lined with chests containing clothing, valuables, and food. The rafters overhead hold suspended foodstuffs, dried fish hanging like bizarre decorations, smoked mutton, bundles of herbs, anything that needs to be kept away from moisture and scavenging animals. Some longhouses even had a second story, essentially a loft space used for storage or extra sleeping area, accessed by a ladder and doubling as the smokiest, hottest part of the house in summer and an ice box in winter. Every vertical surface is utilised, every corner claimed, creating a space that feels simultaneously crowded and organised, chaotic and carefully planned. You're standing there, trying to figure out where you fit in this carefully choreographed morning routine. When someone shoves a tool into your hands, a wooden shovel, you realise, designed for mucking out the byre, the message is clear. If you're going to eat, you're going to work, and the work starts with last night's accumulation of animal waste. You trudge toward the livestock section, the shovel feeling awkward in your hands, completely unprepared for what you're about to experience. The byre section is warmer than the main hall, heated by the mass of living bodies packed into the space. In the growing light, you can count perhaps 6 sheep, 2 cows, and a pony, all standing in straw that's saturated with urine and dotted with fresh dung. The cows regard you with the patient, knowing eyes of creatures who've watched countless humans struggle with this exact task. The smell is eye-watering, a concentrated essence of farm that makes the main hall seem perfumed by comparison. You understand now why the sleeping platforms were built at specific heights anything lower, and you'd be breathing this all night. The historical fact is that Icelandic Vikings were phenomenal animal husbanders, developing unique breeds adapted to the harsh climate. Icelandic sheep, with their dual-layer wool, provided both the soft inner fibres for clothing and the coarse outer hairs for rope and tough fabrics. Icelandic horses, though small, were hardy enough to survive on minimal fodder and sure-footed enough to navigate lava fields. The cows were miniature by modern standards, but gave rich milk that could be processed into skyr butter and cheese, the dairy products that kept Icelanders alive through winters when fresh food was a distant memory. You start shoveling, trying not to think about the fact that this manure will be carefully dried and later burned in the very fire you'll huddle around for warmth. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, appears beside you and demonstrates the proper technique: quick, efficient scoops that maximize load while minimizing effort, tossed into a basket that will be carried outside. The child works with the bored competence of long practice, finishing their section of the byre in the time it takes you to fill the shovel once. They smirk at your universal childhood recognition of adult incompetence and skip away. The social dynamics are becoming clearer. Everyone has a role determined by age, gender, and status, and these roles are reinforced every moment of every day. Men handle the heavy outdoor work. Women manage the household industries like textile production and food preparation. Children perform age-appropriate chores. Thralls do the dirtiest jobs, and elderly family members contribute what they can while claiming the best spots near the fire. You, with your modern confusion and lack of practical skills, rank somewhere below the 7-year-old who just showed you up in manure management. As you finish the mucking out slowly, poorly, but eventually you notice other morning activities accelerating around you. Someone is grinding grain in a quern, the scraping sound of stone on stone adding to the acoustic tapestry of animal noises, crackling fire, and human movement. Another person is stirring a large soapstone pot suspended over the fire, releasing the smell of cooking porridge that almost, but not quite, masks the underlying scent of the byre. The longhouse is transforming from sleeping quarters to workspace, and you're falling further behind with every passing moment. You haul your basket of manure outside, finally escaping the smoky confines, and the morning air hits you like a slap of ice water. The sun is rising, or at least the sky is lightening to a grey that passes for daylight in Icelandic autumn, and you can see your surroundings properly for the first time. The landscape is stark, treeless, a rolling expanse of volcanic rock covered in moss and grass, with mountains in the distance and the constant presence of wind that seems to blow from every direction at once. Other longhouses dot the landscape, each with its own plume of smoke rising from the roof hole, signs of life in a land that otherwise seems determined to remain empty. The midden heap where you're supposed to dump the manure is already substantial, a monument to daily biological necessity that will eventually become fertilizer for the small fields where barley and hay struggle to grow. You add your contribution and turn back toward the longhouse, already dreading going back inside, but knowing the alternative is freezing to death in your modern inadequacy. Your first hour in Viking Iceland has taught you a fundamental truth. Survival here isn't about bravery or intelligence, it's about knowing 1,000 small skills that take years to learn. And you don't have years. You barely have energy for breakfast. Back inside the longhouse, you gravitate toward the fire like a moth to flame, desperate to thaw your hands and face from the brief exposure to Iceland's morning chill. The household is gathering for the morning meal, and you're about to discover that Viking-age breakfast bears absolutely no resemblance to your usual coffee and toast routine. A wooden bowl is thrust into your hands, no ceremony, no "good morning." Just the expectation that you'll take what's offered and be grateful for it, and you peer down at its contents with growing apprehension. The porridge staring back at you is a greyish-brown sludge made from barley that was probably ground weeks ago and has been absorbing the longhouse's ambient smoke flavour ever since. Someone ladles a dollop of skyr on top, and while you might recognise this as the Icelandic yoghurt that trendy modern cafes serve in overpriced bowls, this version is funkier, tangier, with the aggressive sourness of something fermented in conditions that would horrify any health inspector. There's no sugar, no honey to sweeten it. Those are luxuries reserved for special occasions, just the stark reality of grain and cultured milk product that your taste buds immediately register as wrong. You take a tentative bite and the texture is grainy, thick enough to stand a spoon in, while the flavour is aggressively sour with an undertone of smoke that makes you think of licking a campfire. This is fuel, not food in the pleasurable sense. Calories packed into a dense form that will keep you moving through hours of manual labour in sub-freezing temperatures. The historical fact is that Icelanders consumed between 3,000 to 4,000 calories daily during the medieval period. Not because they were gluttons, but because their bodies were constantly burning energy just to maintain core temperature and perform the endless physical work that survival demanded. Beside the porridge, someone has laid out slabs of dried fish stockfish, cod that's been hung in the cold air until it loses 80% of its moisture and becomes hard as wood. You pick up a piece, and it feels like you're holding a small plank. The quirky truth is that you're supposed to beat it with a rock first to break down the fibres, then tear off small pieces to chew slowly, letting your saliva gradually rehydrate the fish until it becomes something approaching edible. The Vikings discovered this preservation method almost by accident, finding that Iceland's cold, dry winds created perfect conditions for drying fish without salt, a crucial discovery since Iceland had no salt deposits and importing it was expensive. You attempt to bite the stockfish directly and nearly crack a tooth. earning chuckles from the children watching your incompetence. A weathered hand belonging to an elderly woman whose face is a roadmap of wrinkles earned through decades of this exact life takes the fish from you, demonstrates the rock-beaten technique, and hands back a slightly more manageable piece. You chew it cautiously, and the taste is intensely fishy, salty from the fish's own preserved juices, with a texture that starts like jerky and gradually becomes something you can actually swallow. It's not terrible, exactly, but it's relentless, the kind of food that announces itself and refuses to be ignored. Then comes the piece de resistance hakal, the fermented shark that's become Iceland's most notorious culinary export. You didn't ask for it, but someone has decided you need to experience this particular Viking delicacy, and a cube of off-white flesh lands in your bowl with a wet plop. The smell hits you before you can even consider tasting it, ammonia mixed with fish, like someone cleaned a bathroom with rotten seafood. Historians still argue whether Vikings ate hakal as a regular food or only during times of scarcity, but the consensus is that Greenland sharks, which are mildly poisonous when fresh, become edible only after being buried and fermented for several months, a process that converts the toxins into something that won't kill you but might make you wish it had. You know you're being tested. Every eye in the longhouse has casually turned your direction, watching to see if the stranger will prove themselves or reveal themselves as weak. You pop the cube in your mouth and immediately regret every decision that led to this moment. The taste is indescribable fishy, yes, but also chemical, burning, with an aftertaste that coats your tongue like a toxic film. You force yourself to swallow rather than spit, and the household's approval is subtle but real, a few nods, a grunt that might be respect, the sense that you've passed a small initiation rite. Bread makes an appearance, but don't expect the fluffy loaves of modern bakeries. Viking age. Icelandic bread is dense, dark, made from barley flour that gives it a heavy, coarse texture studded with bits of grain that didn't quite grind down properly. There's no yeast making it rise into anything approaching lightness. This is flat bread at best, hardtack at worst, designed to fill your stomach and provide carbohydrates that your body can convert to heat and energy. You tear off a chunk, and it requires actual effort, the kind of chewing that makes your jaw ache within minutes. Smearing it with butter helps the rich. Yellow butter churned from milk so thick it's almost cheese, but even lubricated. This bread is work. The drinking situation is its own adventure. Someone passes you a horn, an actual cattle horn, hollowed out and polished, holding what you desperately hope is just water. It's not. The liquid is sour, slightly thick, and you realise you're drinking bland, another fermented milk product that the Vikings consumed in vast quantities because fresh milk spoiled too quickly to be practical. It tastes like watered-down yogurt that started to go off. And the horn itself requires a drinking technique you haven't mastered. You can't set it down without spilling because it has no flat base. So you either finish your portion or hold it awkwardly while trying to eat. The breakfast scene around you is surprisingly quiet. Vikings didn't chat idly over meals like modern families. Eating was serious business. Focused consumption of calories needed for survival. Not a social event. People chew methodically, efficiently, occasionally making brief comments about the day's planned work or weather observations. But mostly there's just the sound of jaws working, the fire crackling, and outside, the eternal wind. You notice that everyone eats with a knife, and their fingers forks won't be common in Europe for centuries, and the knife at each person's belt serves multiple purposes: eating utensil, tool, and weapon. You're still struggling with the bread when someone produces something that actually looks appealing: skirpic jot, wind-dried lamb that's been hanging in a storage shed since last autumn. It's sliced thin, dark red, and the flavour is concentrated, almost sweet. a welcome relief from the assault of fermented products. The meat is chewy but good, seasoned by nothing more than time and air, and you find yourself reaching for more, only to have your hand gently but firmly redirected by the woman managing the food distribution. Portions are controlled, rationed with an eye toward making stores last until next slaughter season, and your modern instinct to eat until full is a luxury this society cannot afford. The quirky reality is that Vikings actually had relatively healthy teeth despite their harsh diet, at least compared to later medieval Europeans, who consumed more refined grains and sugars. The coarse food acted as a natural abrasive, cleaning teeth mechanically, though the inevitable wear-down meant that older Vikings often had teeth ground to nubs. The lack of sugar prevented cavities, but the sheer toughness of the food caused fractures and breaks that, without modern dentistry, could lead to abscesses and infections that killed as surely as any sword wound. Someone passes around dried dulse, a seaweed that was gathered from the shore, dried and stored as both food and seasoning. You try a piece, and it's salty, slightly chewy, with an oceanic flavour that's actually not unpleasant. Seaweed was a crucial supplement in the Icelandic diet, providing vitamins and minerals that were scarce in a landscape where fresh vegetables grew for only a few brief months and imports were expensive when available at all. Combined with the organ meats, Vikings consumed liver, kidney, heart. All the parts modern people often discard. This created a nutritionally complete diet that prevented scurvy and deficiency diseases despite the absence of citrus fruits or year-round greens. As breakfast concludes, you realize your jaw actually hurts from the effort of chewing. Your stomach feels simultaneously full and uncertain about what you've just subjected it to, and your taste buds are in a state of shock from the parade of fermented, dried, smoked, and aggressively flavoured foods. The household is already dispersing to morning tasks, wiping their knives on their clothing and returning them to the belt sheaths, stacking bowls for washing later, moving with the efficient purposefulness of people who cannot afford to waste daylight. You're still sitting there, trying to process the experience, when a child tugs your sleeve and points outside there's work to do, and breakfast, such as it was, is over. Your modern palate has been thoroughly violated. Your teeth feel loosened from their sockets, and you've consumed enough fermented products that your digestive system is likely planning a revolt. But you're fed, you've proven you can swallow hakal without vomiting, and you've survived your first Viking meal. Only about a dozen more challenges await before you can even think about lunch, assuming you live that long. You step outside after breakfast, and the first order of business becomes immediately apparent: you need water. But finding it without dying is more complicated than simply turning on a tap. The household's water situation is a daily puzzle that Vikings solved through a combination of ingenuity, risk assessment, and occasional illness that nobody talks about until someone dies from it. You follow a young woman carrying wooden buckets towards what you hope is a clean water source, watching carefully because your life might literally depend on understanding this routine. Iceland has water everywhere, glacial runoff, streams cascading down mountainsides, springs bubbling from volcanic rock, and yet finding truly safe drinking water is surprisingly challenging. The woman leads you past the obvious nearby stream, which you notice has a faintly murky quality, and instead heads toward a spring about 200 yards from the longhouse. This trek happens multiple times daily, and you're already calculating the caloric cost. Carrying water weighs roughly 8 pounds per gallon, and a household needs dozens of gallons for drinking, cooking, and minimal washing. Your arms ache just watching her heft the full buckets with practiced ease. The spring emerges from between moss-covered rocks, cold and clear, and she fills her buckets with efficient movements that minimize splashing. You kneel to cup some water in your hands, and the temperature shocks your palms. This is glacial melt, probably just a few degrees above freezing, so cold it makes your teeth ache when you drink. But the taste is clean, pure, free from the mineral tang of groundwater or the brackish hint of streams that pass through sheep pastures. Historians still argue whether Vikings understood germ theory in any practical sense. But they definitely knew that some water sources caused the flux dysentery while others didn't, and they chose accordingly. The quirky truth is that Vikings had a complex water hierarchy. Spring water was best for drinking, stream water acceptable for washing clothes or livestock, and stagnant pond water used only for the dirtiest tasks or in emergencies. They even had superstitions about water sources. Some springs were considered sacred, blessed by spirits or Christian saints, depending on when exactly Iceland converted, and taking water from them required small rituals or offerings. You notice the woman murmurs something before filling her buckets, perhaps a prayer, perhaps just habit, the kind of small magic that helps people feel control in an uncontrollable world. But here's what they don't tell you about Viking hygiene. It exists, but not in any form you'd recognise as adequate. Back at the Longhouse, you watch the morning washing ritual commence. And washing is a generous term for what actually happens. A small basin of water is shared by the entire household, yes. The same water, passed from person to person, growing progressively greyer and more questionable with each use. The first person, usually the household head, gets relatively clean water. By the time it reaches the thralls and children, you're essentially wiping your face with a cloth dipped in communal face soup. You're handed the basin after about 8 people have used it, and the water is now tepid and cloudy with a film of oil floating on top, remnants of the sheep lanolin that permeates everything in contact with wool. Which is everything. There's a shared cloth, dampened slightly slimy, and you're expected to wipe down your face and hands with this. You do so gingerly, wondering if you're actually getting cleaner or just redistributing different people's dirt in a sort of bacterial potluck. The historical fact is that Vikings were actually considered quite clean by medieval European standards. They combed their hair, trimmed their beards, and changed their shirts relatively frequently, but clean is a spectrum, and you're discovering that the Viking end of that spectrum still involves shared washing water that would be rejected by modern standards as a biohazard. Then there's the bathing situation, which you'll come to both dread and desperately crave. Full-body bathing doesn't happen daily. The fuel required to heat that much water is prohibitive, but rather weekly if you're lucky, monthly if you're not. When it does happen, it's a production involving the entire household. A large wooden tub is dragged out, water is heated laboriously over the fire in soapstone pots, and then people bathe in order of status, again sharing the same water. By the time the last person climbs in, they're essentially marinating in a human stew that's been seasoned with a dozen bodies' worth of accumulated grime. The sauna tradition exists. Vikings knew about hot steam bathing from their continental cousins, but Iceland's scarcity of wood makes this a rare luxury. Some wealthy farms near geothermal areas exploit natural hot springs, creating bathing pools that are genuinely pleasant, but most Icelanders make do with cold water wipe-downs and the occasional heated bath that's more symbolic cleansing than actual dirt removal. You're learning that clean in Viking Iceland means not actively crusted with filth, a standard that will take considerable psychological adjustment to accept. Laundry is another water-intensive nightmare that you're fortunate to mostly observe rather than participate in, at least this first day. Women are already gathering at a nearby stream with enormous piles of clothing, preparing to beat wool and linen against rocks in water, so cold it turns their hands bright red, then numb white. The soap they use is homemade from animal fat and ash, creating a caustic lye solution that cleans through chemical burning as much as actual washing. You watch them work, their hands moving in rhythms perfected over lifetimes, and realize that every piece of clothing you're wearing represents hours of brutal labor just to keep it from becoming too offensive. The toilet situation, and you knew this was coming as medieval in the most literal sense. There is no bathroom, no outhouse, not even a dedicated hole in the ground. Instead, there's a designated spot some distance from the longhouse, basically just an area where everyone goes to do their business, creating a communal waste zone that grows increasingly foul as the season progresses. You're handed a small wooden stick, essentially a primitive toilet paper substitute that you're expected to use, and then clean or not for the next person. The concept of privacy during elimination is non-existent. People simply walk a suitable distance, squat or stand as anatomy dictates, and handle their business while possibly conversing with neighbours doing the same. Historians still argue about the exact specifics of Viking toilet practices because, understandably, is not something the sagas spent much time describing. Archaeological evidence suggests some farms had small outbuildings that might have served as dedicated toilet spaces, but many simply used the walk far enough that the smell doesn't reach the house method. In winter, when walking far means trudging through snow and risking exposure, people made do with chamber pots that were emptied in the morning, adding their contents to the general midden heap that's becoming a significant landscape feature. The waste management system, such as it exists, relies on cold temperatures, distance, and the hope that decomposition happens faster than accumulation. The midden heap you contributed to earlier is actually a carefully managed resource, human and animal waste mixed with straw, food scraps, and other organic matter, all composting slowly into fertilizer for the small barley fields and hay meadows. Nothing is wasted in Viking Iceland because waste itself is a resource, even if handling it is one of the most degrading tasks in a society already full of degrading tasks. You're given a small horn of something to rinse your mouth, not toothpaste, which is centuries away from invention, but water infused with herbs, maybe mint if they could get it, or just plain water if they couldn't. Vikings cleaned their teeth by chewing willow bark or using rough cloth, scrubbing away food particles with friction alone. Some wealthier individuals had toothpicks carved from bone, exotic items that doubled as status symbols. Your modern dental hygiene routine of brushing twice daily with fluoride toothpaste is impossible, and you can already imagine the build-up beginning, the way your teeth will feel increasingly fuzzy as days pass. The morning's hygiene routine concludes with what passes for deodorant. Nothing. Body odour is universal, accepted, a fact of life that nobody comments on because everyone smells equally ripe. The wool clothing absorbs sweat and oils. The fish oil used to waterproof garments adds its own perfume. And underneath it all is the base scent of human being who burns dung for warmth and shares living space with livestock. You'll come to not notice it. Eventually, your olfactory system adapting to treat this as the normal baseline. But for now, every breath reminds you that you're living in a world where essence of sheep barn is just how people smell. The quirky reality is that Vikings were actually quite concerned with appearance, and grooming combs are among the most common archaeological finds, often elaborately decorated and carried in small cases. They braided hair, trimmed beards into specific styles, and even had beauty standards that valued clear skin and bright eyes. But beauty and hygiene operated on completely different assumptions than modern standards, working within constraints of water scarcity, fuel poverty, and a climate that punished any activity requiring exposed skin or wet hair. As the morning's water and hygiene tasks conclude, you realise you've used more physical energy and encountered more potential pathogens before mid-morning than you might in a modern week. Your hands are chapped from cold water. Your face feels tight from the communal washing cloth's mysterious residue. And you're pretty sure you've violated several health codes that won't be written for another 1,000 years. But you're clean by Viking standards, which means you're acceptable for another day of survival. in a land where staying alive requires constant, exhausting vigilance against dangers both obvious and microscopically invisible. Now that you're fed and marginally cleaner, it's time to address the clothing situation, and you quickly discover that getting dressed in Viking Iceland is less about fashion and more about constructing a wearable survival system from materials that all seem designed to cause maximum discomfort. Someone tosses you a bundle of garments, and you unfold them with growing trepidation, recognizing that each layer represents hours of labor by women whose fingers bled to create the textiles that might keep you from freezing to death. The base layer is a linen shift, or it would be linen if this were a wealthier household with trade connections to flax-growing regions. More likely, it's actually wool. Thin wool woven fine enough to sit against skin, but still unmistakably scratchy in that way that makes you understand why itchy and uncomfortable are nearly synonymous. You pull it over your head, and the sensation is immediate, thousands of tiny wool fibres making contact with your skin. Not painful exactly, but insistently present. A constant low-level irritation that you are assured you'll get used to. Historians still argue whether Vikings wore linen undergarments routinely or if wool on skin was the norm. But in Iceland's economy, where every resource had to be produced locally, wool was king, queen, and the entire royal court. Over the shift goes a longer woolen tunic or dress. Depending on your assigned gender in this medieval situation, the wool is thicker here, woven in a tight twill that provides actual warmth but weighs what feels like 10 pounds. It's dyed a muddy brown or grey. The expensive, bright colours you've seen in museum recreations are for wealthy families or special occasions. Not everyday wear for common farmers. The dye came from local plants, lichen scraped from rocks, or if the household was prosperous, imported materials that cost more than you'd believe. The resulting colours are muted, earthy, practical shades that won't show dirt, which is fortunate because this garment won't be washed frequently. The labour involved in cleaning wool is too intensive for casual laundering. The historical fact is that Icelandic wool became one of the island's most valuable exports, renowned throughout medieval Europe for its quality and warmth. The unique Icelandic sheep developed a double-coat soft, insulating fibres near the skin and longer, water-repellent guard hairs on the outside, creating a textile that was both warm and relatively weatherproof. Women spent countless hours processing this wool washing, carding, spinning, dyeing, weaving, cutting, and sewing, transforming raw fleece into the garments that made survival possible. Every thread you're wearing represents someone's labour, and wasting or damaging clothing was a serious offence in a society where replacement meant months of work. Now comes the wadmal, a thick woolen outer layer that's so dense and heavy it could probably stand up by itself. This is Iceland's signature textile, woven so tightly that it's almost waterproof. Then fooled by stomping or beating in hot water mixed with urine, the ammonia helps felt the fibres together until it shrinks and thickens into something approaching modern felt. You drape it around your shoulders like a cloak, and immediately understand its value. The wind that was cutting through your other layers stops dead against the wadmal, unable to penetrate the compressed wool fibres. But the weight is substantial, like wearing a blanket made of lead, and you're already calculating the energy cost of moving around in this textile armour. The fastening systems are their own challenge. Brooches, not decorative accessories but functional necessities, pin the layers together, and you're handed a pair of oval tortoiseshell brooches actually made from bronze. Not tortoise that you have no idea how to use properly. A patient woman demonstrates the brooches pin the shoulder straps of your overdress, with chains strung between them that serve both decorative and practical purposes, holding the fabric at the right tension while also providing attachment points for necessary tools like needle cases or keys. Getting the tension right is an art too loose and the dress hangs wrong. Too tight and you can't move your arms and you fumble with it embarrassingly while children giggle at your incompetence. Then there are the leg coverings, which you initially mistake for pants but are actually more like very long socks called leg wraps or whining as. You're supposed to wrap these around your legs in a specific spiral pattern, creating both insulation and support, then secure them with leather straps or ties. The process is fiddly, requiring a level of manual dexterity you haven't needed since learning to tie shoes as a child, and your first attempts result in saggy, twisted wrappings that immediately begin to unravel when you try to walk. Someone sighs heavily and redoes them for you, their fingers moving in practiced patterns while you try to memorize the technique you'll need to replicate tomorrow and every day after. Footwear is perhaps the most crucial and most uncomfortable part of the ensemble. You're given shoes made from a single piece of cow or seal skin, folded and stitched around your foot with sinew that's visible along the seams. There are no left or right shoes. They're deliberately ambiguous so you can swap them to even out wear, and no arch support, cushioning, or any of the ergonomic features you've come to expect. The soles are the same leather as the uppers, meaning you feel every pebble, every irregularity in the ground, and wet conditions will soak through in minutes. Inside. There's hay or moss for insulation, the medieval version of insoles, which compresses into a soggy mat that needs daily replacement to prevent your feet from developing the rot that claimed so many Viking toes. The quirky truth is that Vikings were actually quite fashion-conscious within their constraints, using tablet weaving to create decorative borders on clothing, embroidering significant garments with elaborate patterns, and developing regional styles that communicated identity and status. A person's clothing telegraphed their wealth, social position, and even their hometown to anyone who knew how to read the signals. But all that decoration served a practical foundation. The clothes had to keep you alive first, look good second, and every aesthetic choice was made within the iron constraints of what local materials and labour could produce. Now comes the waterproofing, which is where things get truly medieval. Someone approaches with a container of fish oil cod liver oil, specifically rendered down and saved for this exact purpose, and begins rubbing it into the outer layers of your wool. The smell is immediate and overwhelming, a concentrated essence of fish that makes the hakal from breakfast seem subtle by comparison. The oil soaks into the fibres, filling the tiny gaps and creating a hydrophobic barrier that will shed rain and ocean spray. But the cost is that you will smell like a fish market everywhere you go. Vikings in Iceland didn't just live with this smell, they wore it like a second skin. The olfactory price of staying dry in one of the wettest climates in the inhabited world. You're also given a sheepskin cloak, fur side in, which adds another layer of warmth and waterproofing, but also another £5 to your ensemble. With the hood pulled up, you're essentially wearing a small tent, insulated on all sides, protected from wind and wet, but barely able to move under the accumulated weight of multiple wool layers. Fish oil coating and sheepskin. You try to walk and find yourself waddling like an overstuffed doll. Your range of motion severely limited, your body already beginning to sweat under the insulation, even though the air temperature is barely above freezing. The belt situation is crucial. A leather belt cinches everything together at the waist, and from it hang all the tools you'll need throughout the day. A knife is mandatory, its handle worn smooth from constant use. A small pouch holds fire-starting materials, precious charcloth, a piece of flint, a steel striker that represents significant investment. Women wear household keys dangling from chains, symbols of authority over storerooms and resources. Men might carry small whetstones or other trade-specific tools. Everything you need must be on your person, because running back to the house for forgotten items means losing daylight and energy you can't afford to waste. Gloves or mittens are available, but they're crude by modern standards, simply shaped bags of wool or leather that keep your hands warm but make fine manipulation nearly impossible. You'll spend the day pulling them off for detailed work, then quickly replacing them when your fingers start going numb. a constant dance between functionality and preservation. The historical record shows that Vikings did develop more sophisticated glove designs for specific tasks, but everyday wear was these simple mittens that prioritized warmth over dexterity. Your head covering is a simple wool cap or hood, pulled down over your ears, completing the ensemble that transforms you from a recognizable human into an ambulatory pile of textiles and animal products. You catch your reflection in a bucket of water and barely recognize yourself. You're bulky, shapeless, and you smell like a combination of wet sheep, fish market, and wood smoke. The signature scent of Viking Iceland that probably preceded every Norse visitor by several yards. But you're warm, genuinely warm for the first time since arriving, and you understand viscerally why Vikings were willing to endure the discomfort, weight, and smell. The alternative was death by exposure, and suddenly, itchy wool seems like a very reasonable price to pay as you stand there, fully dressed in your medieval survival suit. Someone nods approvingly. You look the part now. Even if you still have no idea how to actually function in these garments. The morning is advancing, the sun climbing toward its pathetically low Arctic arc across the sky. And the real work of the day is about to begin. You're fed, washed, dressed, and absolutely exhausted already, having burned more calories in morning preparation than a modern person might use in half a day. But you're ready. As ready as someone from the 21st century can be, to face whatever challenges a Viking working day has waiting. Spoiler alert, it's going to be absolutely brutal. The morning's actual work begins now, and you quickly discover that chores in Viking Iceland is a laughably inadequate term for the relentless physical labour that fills every moment from dawn until collapse. You're directed toward the home field, the tun where the barley and hay crops require constant attention, even this late in the season, and your modern body, accustomed to perhaps a gym workout or a brisk walk on good days, is about to be introduced to the kind of sustained manual labour that would exhaust a professional athlete. First up is hay collection, because in Iceland hay isn't just animal feed, it's the difference between livestock surviving winter and the entire household starving when the animals die. You're handed a wooden rake, its tines carved from a single piece of wood and smoothed by years of use, and pointed toward a meadow where grass has been cut and left to dry. Your job is to turn the hay, ensuring it dries evenly without rotting, then gather it into ricks that will eventually be transported to storage. Simple enough, right? Except the meadow is the size of several football fields. The rake is heavier than it looks, and you're working at an altitude and latitude where the thin air makes every breath feel insufficient. You begin raking, and within 10 minutes your shoulders are burning. Within 20, your lower back has joined the chorus of complaint. By 30 minutes, you're seriously questioning whether you'll survive until lunch, and you've completed maybe a tenth of the area that needs attention. Meanwhile, the household's children are working alongside you, moving twice as fast with half the effort, their small bodies optimized by a lifetime of this exact labour. A girl who can't be more than 10 is outraking you 3-1, occasionally glancing over with an expression that mixes pity and contempt. The historical fact is that Viking Age Icelanders worked an estimated 16 hours daily during summer months, racing to complete all necessary tasks during the brief period when the weather allowed outdoor work. Winter brought different but equally demanding indoor tasks: textile production, tool repair, food processing, meaning there was effectively no off-season, just different types of exhausting labour. The modern concept of a weekend didn't exist. The closest thing to rest was Sunday church observance after Iceland's conversion to Christianity, and even that was often abbreviated when work demanded. Historians still argue about exactly how much work the average Viking accomplished daily, but archaeological studies of period tools show wear patterns consistent with hours of continuous use, and skeletal remains reveal the physical toll. Enlarged muscle attachment points, worn joints, and compression fractures in spines that bore heavy loads for decades. You're getting a taste of this now. Your soft modern muscles screaming protest at being asked to perform tasks they were never trained for, using biomechanical patterns that evolution designed but civilization let you forget. The hay situation grows more complex when you learn that not all hay is equal. There's the good meadow hay from areas with rich soil and proper drainage, which is saved for the milk cows and breeding stock. Then there's the coarser marsh hay, harvested from wetlands and suitable only for less valuable animals. And there's even seaweed gathered from the shore, dried and used as emergency fodder when land-based hay runs short. Each type requires different handling, different storage, different allocation, and you're expected to somehow know the difference by sight, texture, and location. You don't, of course, and your ignorance earns you sharp corrections from the farmhands who take hay management very seriously because animals that die from poor fodder mean humans who die from starvation. You're moved next to the turf cutting operation, where blocks of earth and grass are being sliced from the ground with specialised cutting tools that look like elongated spades. These turf blocks will repair the longhouse walls, patch the roof, or be used to construct new buildings, making them valuable as any timber in this treeless landscape. The work is backbreaking, literally, requiring you to bend, cut, lift, and stack in a rhythm that makes the hay raking seem leisurely by comparison. Each turf block weighs perhaps 30 pounds and must be handled carefully to prevent crumbling, meaning you can't just throw them around, but must place each one deliberately while your spine gradually compresses under the repeated stress. The quirky truth is that Icelandic turf structures could last generations if properly maintained, with some turf churches and farmhouses remaining habitable for 2 or 3 centuries. The turf itself was carefully selected. Too much grass and it would rot, too much bare earth and it would crumble, and cut at specific times of year when the root systems held everything together optimally. This wasn't just construction, it was a sophisticated understanding of soil science and structural engineering translated into back-breaking manual labour. After an hour of turf cutting, you're reassigned to dung collection, because apparently your morning contribution wasn't sufficient. Armed with a basket and scraper, you're sent to gather sheep droppings from the fields where the animals graze during the day. Every dried pellet is valuable fuel for the long winter, and the household needs literally tons of the stuff to keep fires burning from October through April. You move across the landscape in a crouch, scraping and collecting, your back screaming, your hands developing blisters even through the calluses you're rapidly forming, and your mind rebelling against the absurdity of this being how humans once spent their days. But here's what makes it worse. You're slow. Phenomenally, embarrassingly slow. Where experienced workers can harvest enough dung in an hour to fuel a fire for 2 days, you're managing perhaps a quarter of that. Your unfamiliar hands fumbling with the tools, your untrained eyes missing deposits that locals spot instantly. Efficiency in these tasks isn't just about working hard, it's about technique refined over lifetimes, about knowing exactly how to move your body to maximize output while minimizing energy expenditure. You have none of this knowledge, and it shows in every awkward motion, every wasted movement, every task that takes you triple the time it should. The morning's labour continues with fence repair because Iceland's constant wind and occasional sheep are hell on boundary markers. You're handed tools and pointed toward a section of stone wall. Iceland has no wood for fences, so barriers are built from the volcanic rocks that litter every landscape, where winter damage needs correction. Lifting rocks ranging from basketball to small boulder size, fitting them together without mortar in a stable configuration that will withstand wind and wandering livestock, requires a combination of strength, spatial reasoning, and sheer stubborn persistence that you're discovering you lack. Your hands, soft from a lifetime of keyboard work and smartphone scrolling, are developing blisters that burst and bleed, the raw flesh mixing with dirt and sheep dung in a medieval smoothie of infection risk. Vikings had calluses thick as leather, hands transformed by labour into tools themselves. But your pampered skin is surrendering immediately. Someone tosses you strips of wool cloth to wrap your palms, a crude bandage that helps minimally while adding to the general discomfort of your existence. By midday, which feels like a lifetime away, you'll have friction burns, muscle strains, and a comprehensive understanding of why medieval life expectancy was so much shorter than modern standards. The work assignments keep coming because the household operates like a military campaign against scarcity, every task essential, every delay potentially catastrophic. You're sent to collect water, again, because the household goes through gallons daily and someone needs to maintain supply. You're directed to help repair fishing nets, the tedious fingerwork of mending tears in equipment that represents significant investment and provides crucial protein. You're assigned to help transport barley sheaves from the field to the storage barn, each bundle heavy enough to make your knees buckle, the distance just far enough that you make the trip a dozen times, while stronger workers manage twice your output. Between tasks there's no break, no coffee pause, no scrolling through social media to rest your mind. The only pause comes when absolutely necessary. To drink water from the shared horn, to adjust clothing that's chafing, to catch your breath before the next assignment. Vikings didn't work themselves to death deliberately. They simply lived in an environment where survival required maximum effort from every able body, and anything less meant genuine risk of starvation, freezing, or social ostracism for failing to contribute your share. You notice the sun's position, still pathetically low in the sky despite hours having passed, and realize you're not even halfway through the work day. Your body is already composing a comprehensive letter of complaint to every muscle group. Your hands are bleeding through the wrappings. Your back has discovered pain receptors you didn't know existed, and the day's real challenges haven't even started. The morning's work would kill a modern gym routine, would violate labour laws in every developed nation, would seem impossible if you weren't living it moment by agonising moment. A bell or horn sounds, the signal for the midday meal, and you nearly weep with relief. You've survived the morning, barely, through a combination of desperate effort and the household's low expectations for the strange newcomer who can't even rake hay properly. You stumble back toward the longhouse, your legs barely functioning, your entire body one comprehensive ache, and realise with sinking certainty that after lunch, there's a whole afternoon of this waiting. The Viking work ethic wasn't about noble persistence or warrior spirit. It was about the brutal calculus that working yourself to exhaustion was the only alternative to dying of exposure or starvation in a land that offered no gentle middle ground. You collapse near the long fire for the midday meal, every muscle trembling from exertion, and discover that Iceland's legal and social systems are almost as harsh as its physical landscape. While you're trying to recover enough to lift food to your mouth, the household head announces that tomorrow there's a gathering at the local thing. Not thing as in object, but thing. The outdoor assembly where Icelanders settled disputes, made laws, and occasionally started blood feuds that would echo through generations. Your attendance is apparently mandatory, and someone begins explaining the rules you'll need to survive, because legal ignorance in Viking Iceland can get you killed just as surely as freezing to death. The old thing, Iceland's National Assembly, meets only in summer at Thingvellir, but local things happen throughout the year, and you're about to attend one where two neighbouring families are disputing ownership of driftwood. Driftwood, you learn with growing disbelief, is serious business in a treeless country where timber is more valuable than silver. A single log washed ashore can mean the difference between building necessary structures and going without, and the legal proceedings around such finds are baroque in their complexity and absolutely ruthless in their execution. The historical fact is that Iceland developed one of the medieval world's most sophisticated legal systems, entirely oral and memorized by specialists called law speakers who could recite the entire law code from memory. Iceland had no king, No central executive authority, just a commonwealth of chieftains and farmers who gathered annually to argue, legislate, and occasionally settle disputes through combat when words failed. This was democracy of a sort, but democracy where your vote was weighted by how many armed men you could bring to support your position, and where legal precedent could be established by whoever shouted loudest or fought most convincingly. Someone hands you the wooden token, you're summoned to attend as a witness or supporter, you're not entirely clear which, and begins coaching you on proper thing behaviour. You must arrive armed but peaceful, carrying weapons openly as a sign of free status, but not drawing them unless violence is formally declared. You must stand with your household's group, showing solidarity even if you privately think their claim is nonsense. You must be prepared to swear oaths on sacred rings or Christian relics, depending on when exactly this historical moment falls in Iceland's religious transition, and breaking such oaths means outlawry, a death sentence delivered through social exclusion rather than execution. The quirky truth is that Iceland's legal system had categories of crimes and punishments that seem almost comically specific to modern eyes. There were different penalties for different types of insults. Calling someone a coward was worse than questioning their ancestry, and both were serious enough to justify violence in response. There were precise compensations for injuries, a lost eye worth more than a lost finger, a blow to the face worth more than the same blow to the back, because the public nature of the insult mattered as much as the physical damage. And there were crimes like theft of manure or illegal sheep grazing that could escalate into feuds lasting generations. Historians still argue about how often these legal proceedings resulted in actual violence versus settlement. But the sagas are full of stories where minor disputes, a stolen bucket, an insult at a feast, a boundary disagreement, spiraled into bloodbaths that decimated families and reshaped political alliances. The thing assemblies were pressure valves for social tension, but sometimes, instead of releasing pressure safely, they exploded into violence that made the original dispute seem trivial by comparison. You're being warned to stay quiet, stand still, and avoid eye contact with anyone from the opposing side, because even an accidental slight could turn you into a target. The driftwood dispute you'll witness tomorrow has apparently been building for months. One farmer claims he spotted the log first, marked it with his sign, and has prior claim based on coastal boundaries established decades ago. The other farmer claims the tide carried the log onto his land, making it his by right of where it landed, and besides, the first farmer's boundary markers are disputed and possibly fraudulent. Both have assembled supporters, called in favours from allied chieftains, and are prepared to argue their cases with the passion usually reserved for murder trials, because in Iceland's resource-scarce economy, this single log represents genuine wealth. You're told that if you're called to testify, you must speak clearly, without hesitation, and support your household's position regardless of truth. The concept of objective testimony doesn't really exist. You're expected to be loyal first, honest second, and your credibility depends more on your social standing and connections than any actual knowledge of events. If you contradict your household's story, you've betrayed them, possibly earning outlawry yourself, or at minimum destroying your reputation and making your survival in this tight-knit community nearly impossible. The legal vocabulary alone is overwhelming. You learn terms like vargir I veum, wolf in the sacred places, meaning an outlaw stripped of all legal protection who can be killed without consequence. There's sekar, meaning guilty but with different degrees and types requiring different penalties. There's bot, the compensation payment that can settle disputes without violence, calculated through complex formulas involving the status of victim and perpetrator, the nature of the offence, and the current political climate. Missing a payment or offering insufficient bot is itself an insult requiring response, creating cascading cycles of obligation and revenge. The thing assembly isn't just about resolving the driftwood dispute, it's theatre, a performance where families display their strength, forge alliances, and establish social hierarchies that will govern interactions until the next gathering. You're expected to dress in your best clothing, which you don't have, bring gifts for allies, which you can't afford, and generally project an image of prosperity and power, even if you're one bad harvest from starvation. The Viking legal system operated on appearance and reputation as much as actual justice, rewarding those who could perform confidence and punishing those who showed weakness. Someone mentions, almost casually, that duels sometimes settle disputes that words cannot. Not the Hollywood version with dramatic swordplay, but the formal holmgang, combat fought on a small marked area, with specific rules about weapons, shields, and the number of exchanges allowed. Being challenged to holmgang is a serious matter. Refusing marks you as a coward and can result in social death worse than actual death. Accepting means potential injury or death in combat, against someone who's probably been training since childhood while you've been pushing papers or staring at screens. You make a mental note to avoid any situation that might be construed as challenge-worthy, which basically means avoiding everything and everyone. The legal intricacies continue piling up. You learn about the quarter courts and the fifth court, the different jurisdictions and their specific procedures. You learn that procedural errors, calling witnesses in the wrong order, using incorrect formulas for oaths, standing in the wrong position, can invalidate entire cases, leading to sophisticated legal gamesmanship where lawyers, though they are not called that, try to trap opponents in technical violations. Iceland's oral legal tradition required lawyers to memorize not just laws but precedents, procedures, and the genealogies necessary to establish standing and credibility, creating a specialist class whose mental capacity staggers modern imagination. You're warned about the summer games that happen alongside thing assemblies, wrestling matches, horse fights, tests of strength and skill that seem like entertainment but actually serve to establish dominance hierarchies and settle minor disputes without formal legal proceedings. Losing badly at these games can damage your reputation almost as much as losing a legal case, because physical prowess and social standing are intimately linked in Viking culture. Winning, however, especially against higher status opponents, can be equally dangerous, as some men don't take defeat gracefully and might manufacture legal disputes to restore their honour. The midday meal continues as this legal education proceeds, and you realise that surviving Viking Iceland isn't just about physical endurance, it's about navigating a social and legal minefield where every word, gesture and relationship carries weight and consequence. The driftwood dispute that seemed trivial now appears as a crucial test of household strength and social standing, where the outcome matters less than how effectively your side performs in front of the community. You're expected to play a role in this performance, despite having no script, no understanding of the stakes, and no idea how easily you could trigger violence through simple ignorance. Someone passes you more of that morning's terrible bread, and you chew mechanically while contemplating tomorrow's thing assembly. Your body is already destroyed from the morning's labour. You're dressed in clothing that marks you as a poor household member. You have no gifts or weapons worthy of display, and you're about to enter a legal theatre where one wrong move could start a feud that ends in bloodshed. The Viking legal system, for all its sophistication, operated on principles of honour, shame and violence that make modern law seem almost gentle by comparison. Justice wasn't blind. It could see exactly who you were, how many warriors you commanded, and whether your ancestors were worth remembering, and it judged accordingly. As the meal concludes and you prepare to return to afternoon labour, someone claps you on the shoulder with what might be encouragement, or might be mockery. You're still learning to read these social cues, and reminds you that the thing assembly will be an honour to attend. An honour you think bitterly, like being honoured with frostbite, malnutrition, and the constant threat of violent death. But you nod, force something approximating a smile, and mentally add navigate complex legal system without starting blood feud, to the growing list of impossible tasks required for survival. The afternoon's work awaits, and somewhere in the back of your mind you're already dreading tomorrow's assembly, where your ignorance and incompetence will be on full display before the entire community. The afternoon work assignments resume, but now you're acutely aware of something you'd taken completely for granted in modern life: the ability to regulate your body temperature. In Viking Iceland, you're locked in a constant, exhausting battle against the cold, not the dramatic, acute cold of the winter storm that would kill you in hours, but the insidious, grinding cold that leaches heat from your body minute by minute, requiring constant vigilance and energy expenditure just to maintain core temperature enough to function. You're about to learn that hypothermia isn't just a winter concern, it's a year-round threat lurking in every season, every activity, every moment of existence. You're sent to help repair the turf roof of an outbuilding, which means climbing onto the structure and working exposed to the wind that never seems to stop blowing across Iceland's treeless landscape. The moment you ascend the ladder, the wind hits differently. Not the ground-level breeze you've been experiencing, but the full force of air sweeping unobstructed across the North Atlantic. The temperature drops perceptibly, or rather the wind chill, a concept Vikings didn't have words for but understood intimately, transforms merely cold air into a heat-stealing force that cuts through your layers of wool and fish oil like they're barely there. Your fingers are the first casualties. Within minutes of working with cold, damp turf blocks, you can feel the heat draining from your extremities as your body prioritizes keeping your core warm. The historical fact is that Vikings developed Raynaud's phenomenon at rates modern doctors would consider epidemic, a condition where fingers and toes lose circulation in response to cold, turning white then blue, sometimes resulting in permanent damage or loss of digits. You flex your fingers repeatedly trying to maintain blood flow, but the work requires fine manipulation of tools and materials that's nearly impossible with numb hands. Someone working beside you notices you're struggling and demonstrates the Viking solution, periodically stopping work to thrust your hands into your armpits, using your core heat to rewarm them before they cross the line into genuine frostbite. It's inefficient, interrupting the work rhythm every few minutes, but it's necessary. Historians still argue about exactly how many Vikings lost fingers and toes to cold injury versus other causes, but skeletal evidence shows high rates of shortened digits and bone changes consistent with repeated freezing and thawing cycles. You're getting a preview of how easy it would be to join those statistics. The wind is relentless, and you discover that it's not just uncomfortable, it's actively dangerous. Your body is burning calories at an accelerated rate just to maintain temperature, meaning the breakfast that seemed so filling is being consumed as fuel far faster than in a temperate climate. Vikings in Iceland needed those 3,000, 4,000 daily calories not for the physical work alone, but for the constant thermogenesis required to survive in an environment where the average temperature, even in summer, rarely exceeds 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. And wind makes it feel far colder. You're wearing multiple layers, but sweat is becoming a problem. The exertion of lifting turf blocks and wielding tools generates heat, causing perspiration that soaks into your wool layers. In a modern synthetic fabric, this might wick away harmlessly, but wool, for all its insulating properties when dry, becomes a liability when wet. It's heavy, it loses much of its insulating value, and it takes hours to dry against your body. You're trapped in a no-win scenario. Work hard enough to stay warm, and you sweat, creating wet layers that will chill you dangerously when you stop. Work slowly to avoid sweating, and you risk hypothermia from insufficient heat generation. The quirky truth is that Vikings developed sophisticated layering strategies to manage this exact problem, using different wool grades for different layers, coarse outer layers that shed moisture, fine inner layers that trapped air for insulation, and strategic ventilation through garment openings that could be adjusted to regulate heat and moisture. But you don't know these techniques. Stumbling through trial and error that could easily prove fatal. You open your outer layer to cool down, and immediately the wind penetrates, chilling the sweat against your skin. You close her again, and within minutes you're overheating once more, trapped in a thermal oscillation that's exhausting in itself. Your feet are their own nightmare. The leather shoes that seemed adequate this morning have been soaking up moisture from the damp turf, from your own foot sweat, from the general humidity of Iceland's climate, and they're now conducting cold directly to your feet. The hay insulation has compressed into a soggy mat that provides minimal cushioning and no warmth. You can feel your toes going numb, that distinctive tingling sensation that warns of impending cold injury, and you stamp your feet repeatedly, trying to force blood back into the extremities while not falling off the roof you're supposedly repairing. Someone calls for a break, and you gratefully descend the ladder, heading for the longhouse and the precious fire. But here's another cruel reality. Rewarming isn't the relief you imagine. As blood rushes back into your chilled extremities, the pain is intense, a burning, aching sensation that makes you gasp. This is the hot aches that anyone who's experienced serious cold knows intimately, the price your nervous system extracts for allowing your tissues to cool beyond safe levels. You hold your hands near the fire, not too close because you've been warned that rapid rewarming of frozen tissue can cause more damage, and endure the agony of your body's circulatory system rebooting. The household's children don't seem to suffer these problems, or at least not to the same degree. They've been born into this cold, their bodies adapting from infancy to the constant thermal stress. They have better circulation in their extremities, higher baseline metabolic rates, and unconscious behaviours that minimise cold injury. The way they move, how they position their bodies relative to wind when they seek shelter. You're learning these lessons the hard way, through pain and near injury, acquiring in hours a crash course that normally takes a childhood to master. Historians still argue about whether Vikings experienced hypothermia differently than modern people, or if they simply accepted it as inevitable. The sagas mention cold injuries almost casually. Frostbitten noses, frozen toes, the blue-tinged skin of someone who spent too long exposed, suggesting these were common enough to need no dramatic emphasis. The archaeological record shows evidence of cold-related pathologies in Viking Age remains, but determining cause of death from bones alone is challenging. What's clear is that Vikings lived with cold in a way modern heated existence has made foreign to most humans. After warming briefly, you're sent back out. The work isn't finished, and daylight is precious even if it's weak grey and seems to provide more psychological benefit than actual warmth. This time you're harvesting kelp from the shore, wading into water so cold it takes your breath away even through the leather shoes that provide minimal protection. The shock of cold water is immediate and overwhelming, your body's gasp reflex triggering involuntarily, and you understand viscerally how easily someone could drown in water that's merely cold, not frozen, simply from the body's panicked response to thermal shock. The kelp harvesting is crucial. Seaweed provides food, fertilizer, and fodder, but it requires working in the intertidal zone where every wave brings new, frigid water swirling around your legs. Within minutes, your feet and calves are completely numb, sensation replaced by a distant aching that you try to ignore while pulling kelp from rocks. Vikings did this regularly, seasonally, accepting the cold water exposure as necessary, but you're discovering that necessity doesn't make it easier, just unavoidable. Your teeth are chattering uncontrollably, your hands shaking too badly to grip the slippery kelp effectively, and you're genuinely concerned about your ability to walk back to shore on legs that feel like frozen stumps. Someone pulls you from the water. You've been in too long, your inexperience showing again, and forces you to run along the beach. The movement generating heat that slowly, agonizingly returns sensation to your lower extremities. The pain is extraordinary, worse than the numbing cold, a comprehensive ache that radiates from your toes through your entire lower body. You're learning that in Viking Iceland, warming up hurts almost as much as freezing, creating a cycle of discomfort that never truly ends, just varies in intensity and location. The afternoon wears on through various tasks, carrying water that sloshes and soaks your clothing with its frigid contents, mending nets while sitting in the wind that steals heat faster than you can generate it, moving between outdoor work and brief indoor warming sessions that provide temporary relief but never quite restore you to comfortable warmth. You're exhausted not just from labour but from the constant thermodynamic battle. Your body's resources depleted by the dual demands of work and temperature maintenance. By the time the sun begins its pathetic descent toward the horizon, barely having climbed above it in the first place, you're comprehensively cold in a way that goes beyond mere discomfort. You're shivering uncontrollably, your speech slightly slurred from facial muscles that won't cooperate properly, your thinking foggy in that distinctive way that warns of genuine hypothermia. In modern terms, you'd be at the stage where medical intervention becomes necessary, but in Viking Iceland, this is just Tuesday afternoon, the normal state of existence that everyone manages because the alternative is giving up entirely. The household calls an end to outdoor work as the light fails, and you stumble toward the longhouse, your frozen clothing crackling slightly with ice crystals, your hands too numb to properly work the door latch. Someone helps you inside, pushes you toward the fire, begins the process of warming you safely while mocking your weakness. Because in Viking Iceland, succumbing to cold after just one afternoon of work marks you as soft, unfit, unlikely to survive the real challenges that winter will bring. You huddle by the flames, shaking violently, and realise that you've just experienced a mild day by Viking standards. The true cold, the deep winter freeze, the storms that keep everyone trapped indoors for days, those are still to come, and you've already nearly hypothermia'd yourself in relatively gentle autumn weather. The cold equation of Viking Iceland is brutally simple. Your body burns fuel to generate heat, work generates more heat but requires more fuel, and the environment constantly steals heat faster than you can replace it. The only solution is to keep moving, keep eating, keep the fire burning, and accept that true warmth is a distant memory and a future hope, never a present reality. You're learning to live in the narrow band between freezing and overheating, to recognise the warning signs of cold injury before permanent damage occurs, and to understand why Vikings were so obsessed with fire, shelter, and the precious calories that kept the furnace of human metabolism burning against the endless, patient cold of the North Atlantic. As evening approaches and the household gathers for the main meal, you're thrust into the social minefield that makes Viking Iceland's physical challenges seem almost straightforward by comparison. The seating arrangement for dinner isn't random. It's a carefully choreographed display of hierarchy, honour, and deadly serious social positioning where sitting in the wrong spot could literally get you killed. You hover uncertainly near the door, unsure where you belong in this pecking order, while others file in with the confidence of people who've known their place since childhood. The high seat, the place of honour reserved for the household head, is positioned along the northern wall, elevated slightly and marked by ornately carved posts that probably travelled with the family from Norway generations ago. His wife sits beside him, her own seat nearly as prestigious, because women in Viking Iceland wielded real power over household management, keys jangling at her belt like symbols of domestic authority. On either side of these seats of power, people arrange themselves in descending order of importance. Adult sons and daughters, close relatives, valued workers, and finally, at the fringes near the door where cold air leaks in with every opening, the thralls and least significant household members. You're guided, pushed, really, toward a spot that makes your status painfully clear. Near the door, downwind from the fire's warmth, on a bench so far from the high seat that you can barely see the household head through the smoky gloom. This is where strangers sit, where the unfree labour force huddles, where anyone without clear social standing gets relegated until they prove themselves worthy of better placement. The historical fact is that Vikings obsessed over seating arrangements with an intensity that modern people reserve for social media follower accounts, because your seat literally defined your worth, your honour, and your right to respect within the community. Someone leans over and whispers a warning. Never, under any circumstances, attempt to sit above your station. The sagas are full of stories where men killed each other over seating disputes, where entire blood feuds began because someone claimed a seat their rivals felt they hadn't earned. An Irish visitor once sat in the wrong spot at an Icelandic feast and sparked a confrontation that ended with 3 dead and a decades-long revenge cycle. Seating isn't just about comfort, it's about honour, that nebulous but absolutely crucial concept that governed every social interaction and could be defended with lethal force when challenged. The meal begins to arrive, carried by women and thralls who navigate the crowded benches with practiced ease, and you notice immediately that portions aren't equal. The high seat receives the best cuts of meat, the freshest bread, the largest servings of every dish. As you move down the social ladder, the food quality and quantity decline proportionally. By the time dishes reach your section, you're looking at the scraps, the burned edges, the smallest portions of already meagre offerings. This isn't accidental or cruel, it's the fundamental structure of Viking society, where resources flow according to status, and lower-ranked individuals accept lesser shares as the price of inclusion in the household at all. You watch the household head carefully, because historians still argue about the exact protocols, but everyone agrees that beginning to eat before the master does constitutes a serious insult. He lifts his horn of ale first, not the fermented milk product from breakfast, but actual ale brewed from the precious barley that could have been bread instead, and drinks deeply. Only then does the rest of the household reach for their portions, a ripple of permission flowing down the benches from high status to low. You wait until those around you begin eating, then cautiously reach for your wooden bowl. The food is better than breakfast, or at least more substantial. Boiled mutton that's been cooking over the fire all day, softening until even the toughest cuts become edible. There's blood sausage, dark and rich, made from animal blood mixed with fat and grain, stuffed into intestines and cooked until firm. You try a piece, and the flavour is intense, metallic and savoury, the kind of food that makes you understand how Vikings survived on limited resources. They ate everything, wasted nothing, found nutrition in parts of animals that modern sensibilities have trained us to reject. The conversation flows around you in Old Norse that you're struggling to follow, but the cadence and tone make certain things clear. People are discussing the upcoming Thing assembly, debating the driftwood dispute, making alliances and positioning themselves for social advantage. You catch fragments, something about witness testimony, about the boundary markers, about old grievances being settled alongside new ones. The quirky truth is that Viking dinner conversation regularly covered topics that would seem inappropriate to modern sensibilities. Violent feuds discussed with the same tone as weather, sexual conquests recounted as entertainment, insults traded as a form of verbal combat that kept actual combat skills sharp. Someone passes around a communal horn of ale, and you're expected to drink and pass it on, a ritual that builds fellowship while also getting everyone progressively drunk. The ale is strong, unfiltered, with grain particles floating in it, and a yeasty taste that's not unpleasant but definitely unfamiliar. You take a measured sip, aware that getting drunk in this environment could be dangerous. Loose lips start feuds, and impaired judgment might lead you to accept challenges you can't fulfill, or make promises you can't keep. But refusing the horn entirely would mark you as antisocial, possibly hostile, so you find the middle path. Drink enough to participate, not enough to lose control. The seating dynamic becomes more complex as the meal progresses. A visiting farmer arrives, apparently expected, though no one mentioned it to you, and immediately people shuffle to accommodate him at a position that reflects his status. This triggers a cascade of repositioning. everyone moving up or down slightly to maintain proper hierarchy. You're pushed even further toward the door, your seat now practically in the draft, and you understand that your position isn't fixed but fluid, responsive to every change in the household's social composition. Being at the bottom means being constantly displaced, always making room for others, never secure in even your lowly spot. The household head begins telling a story, not a casual anecdote, but a formal saga recitation, and everyone falls silent to listen. His voice carries the rhythmic, alliterative patterns of skaldic verse, recounting deeds of ancestors who fought in Norway, who claimed this land, who established the family's honour through violence, cunning and survival. You're witnessing the oral tradition that preserved Icelandic history before writing became common, and it's simultaneously impressive. The memorization, the performance skill, and disturbing, because the story glorifies feuds, celebrates vengeance, and reinforces the cultural values that make this society so dangerous for the uninitiated. The tale involves a great-grandfather who killed 3 men in a dispute over grazing rights, then successfully argued his case at the Old Thing, walking away not just acquitted, but enriched by compensation from the victims' families for having to endure the inconvenience of trial. The household nods approvingly at key moments, clearly having heard this story countless times, but still finding affirmation in its message. Honour matters more than life. Clever legal manoeuvring can transform murder into acceptable behaviour, and strength, physical or social, determines justice more reliably than abstract right and wrong. A child interrupts, a serious breach of etiquette, and is immediately hushed with a severity that seems excessive until you understand that disrupting saga recitation is genuinely offensive. The oral tradition depends on uninterrupted performance, on maintaining the rhythmic flow that aids memorization and transmission. The child looks chastened, and you file away another rule. When the saga begins, silence is mandatory, attention is required, and showing proper respect for ancestral stories is as important as showing respect for living family members. The visiting farmer, once the saga concludes, begins his own story in response, a reciprocal gesture that advances his agenda while seeming to merely entertain. His tale involves a boundary dispute, not coincidentally similar to the driftwood case that's going to the Thing, where his ancestor established possession through first use and continuous occupation. The message is clear to everyone in the room. He's positioning himself and his precedent for the upcoming legal battle, using dinner conversation as a courtroom preview. You're learning that nothing in Viking Iceland is casual. Every social interaction is strategic. Every story serves a purpose. Every moment loaded with implications that outsiders miss at their peril. Insults begin flying, but these aren't angry outbursts. They're ritualized verbal sparring called manjafnada, comparing men's worth through elaborately constructed mockery. Someone suggests that another's father was better at boasting than fighting. The response comes quick. At least his father could grow a beard, unlike some men who look like smooth-chinned thralls. Laughter ripples through the hall, but you notice hands near knife hilts, bodies tensing slightly. These verbal games can turn deadly in seconds if someone misjudges the line between acceptable mockery and genuine insult requiring violent response. You keep your mouth shut, knowing that anything you say will be wrong. You lack the cultural fluency to navigate these verbal duels, the family history to make relevant comparisons, the social standing to mock anyone without inviting crushing retaliation. Silence from your position near the door is expected, perhaps even wise, but it also marks you as an outsider, someone who can't participate in the social rituals that bind the household together. You're simultaneously present and excluded, fed but not included, sheltered but not belonging. The meal winds down as the fire burns lower, but before people disperse to evening tasks, the household head makes an announcement. Tomorrow at the Thing, everyone must stand together, present a united front, show the community that this household is strong, cohesive, and not to be challenged. Eyes turn toward you. Even you must participate, must stand with the group even if you don't understand the issues, must be counted among the household's strength even if your contribution is purely numerical. You nod agreement, having no real choice, and wonder how you'll navigate tomorrow's assembly without exposing your ignorance and shaming the household that's grudgingly given you shelter. As people rise from the benches, you notice the careful procedure. Lower-ranked individuals wait for those above them to move first, creating an orderly exit that reinforces the hierarchy one final time. You wait until nearly everyone has left, then rise from your cold spot near the door, your legs stiff from the awkward bench, your stomach uncomfortably full of rich food your modern digestion isn't equipped to handle efficiently. The social minefield of Viking dinner has been navigated successfully, barely, and you've learned that survival here requires not just physical endurance, but social intelligence. The ability to read unspoken rules, to position yourself correctly, to participate in rituals whose meanings you can only guess at. Tomorrow brings a thing assembly where these skills will be tested publicly, where your incompetence might have consequences beyond personal discomfort. But tonight, you've survived another meal, held your tongue when necessary, and avoided starting any feuds that would require your death to settle. In Viking Iceland, that counts as a successful evening. The evening's supposed leisure time reveals aspects of Viking Iceland that modern sensibilities find even more disturbing than the physical hardships. You're sitting near the fire, trying to warm yourself after dinner, when you notice the household's dynamics with fresh horror. The thralls moving through their tasks with the resigned efficiency of people who own nothing, not even themselves, and a conversation nearby about infant exposure that's discussed with the same casual tone as tomorrow's weather. The settlement's dark secrets aren't hidden because they are not considered shameful. They're simply the brutal arithmetic of survival in a land that offers no gentle options. The thralls, slaves, though the term sounds almost too harsh for the complex reality, are everywhere once you start noticing them. That woman carrying water, the man mucking out the byre before dawn, the child who showed you up at hay raking, many of them are unfree. Their labour owned by the household, their lives circumscribed by bonds both legal and social. The historical fact is that Viking Age Iceland ran on slave labour, with perhaps 10 to 20% of the population living in bondage, captured in raids on Ireland and Scotland, or born into thraldom from enslaved parents. These aren't the distant, abstract slaves of history books, but real people moving through the longhouse, sleeping in the coldest corners, eating the worst food, wearing the most threadbare clothing. You watch a thrall woman nursing an infant, her own child you assume, until someone casually mentions that the baby will be taken and exposed if it shows any weakness, or if the household decides they can't afford another mouth to feed. Infant exposure, the practice of leaving unwanted babies outside to die from exposure, was legal in Iceland until Christianity banned it, though historians still argue about how commonly it was actually practiced versus threatened. The sagas mention it matter-of-factly. The child was exposed, with no more emotional weight than the sheep were sheared. Your modern horror at this practice is met with blank incomprehension. What else would you do with a deformed child or a female infant when you needed sons, or a thrall's baby that would consume resources for years before providing value? The decision about which children live and which are exposed typically falls to the father, who examines newborns shortly after birth. A strong, healthy boy would be sprinkled with water and named, signalling acceptance into the family. A sickly infant, a girl born when daughters are already numerous, or any child with visible defects might be rejected, left outside on a hillside or in a designated exposure area where the cold would take them within hours. The quirky, horrible truth is that this wasn't considered murder in the legal sense. The child hadn't been formally accepted into the community, and therefore removing it was more like discarding potential than ending actual life, at least according to Viking Age logic that prioritised group survival over individual existence. You notice the thrall's children playing in the corner, and someone explains the brutal calculus. These children might be sold when old enough to have value, or kept if they seem strong enough to provide more labour than they consume, or simply worked until they break because replacing them is easier than maintaining them. A thrall's child born in the household might earn eventual freedom through exceptional service or the owner's generosity, but more likely they'll inherit their parents' status, passing bondage down through generations like a terrible genetic trait. The woman you've been watching, the one who helped you with the fish oil waterproofing, she's a thrall, captured in Ireland as a teenager, now middle-aged and worn down by decades of service she never chose. The household head's authority over thralls is essentially absolute. He can sell them, beat them, work them to death, or free them at whim, with minimal legal consequence as long as he doesn't damage another man's property. Because that's what thralls are. Property valued somewhere between livestock and tools, their lives measured in economic utility rather than inherent worth. Historians still argue about whether Viking Age slavery was better than later systems. Thralls could earn freedom, owned small personal property, occasionally married free people. But these minor mercies don't change the fundamental reality of human beings owned, used, and discarded according to their owner's needs and whims. You're handed a cup of ale and realise it was poured by a thrall whose name you don't know, who exists in your presence but not really as a person you've considered. The complicity hits you. You're benefiting from this system, eating food they prepared, sleeping in warmth they maintain, existing in a social structure built on their labour without consent. Your modern moral framework recoils, but you're also aware that your personal refusal to participate would change nothing, might even get you classified as problematic, potentially enslaved yourself if you're not careful about maintaining the free status that's your only protection. The conversation around the fire turns to the next raiding season. Iceland's poor resources mean many young men seek wealth abroad, and the distinction between trading voyage and slave-taking raid is often minimal. They discuss Ireland's coastal settlements with the casual evaluation of farmers, discussing which fields to harvest, calculating the risk versus reward of attacks that will bring back silver, goods, and human cargo. Women and children make the best thralls, you overhear, less dangerous than captured warriors, more valuable than raw materials, easily sold at markets in Dublin or Bergen or kept for household use. Someone mentions a particularly successful raid from years past, when the household acquired 3 Irish thralls in one voyage, 2 women and a boy, all still serving, their lives completely transformed by a single day of violence they couldn't prevent or predict. The story is told with pride, celebrating the ancestors' cunning in choosing the right target and securing valuable property, with no apparent consideration for the victim's perspective, the families destroyed, the freedoms annihilated. You're learning that Viking valour and Viking horror are inseparable, that the same culture producing sophisticated poetry and legal systems also routinely devastated foreign communities and trafficked human beings with no moral qualms whatsoever. The thralls themselves show a range of adaptations to their status. Some work with sullen resentment barely concealed, others with the efficiency of people who've accepted their fate, and a few with apparent contentment that might be genuine or might be survival strategy. You can't tell. A young thrall woman laughs at someone's joke, and you wonder if she's truly amused or performing the cheerfulness that might earn slightly better treatment, slightly more food, slightly less brutal work assignments. The psychology of enslavement is complex, and you're watching it play out in real time with all its uncomfortable ambiguities. The legal status of thralls creates bizarre situations. They can't testify in court, their word has no legal weight, which means crimes against them are essentially unprosecutable unless they damage their owner's property rights. A thrall murdered by someone outside the household requires compensation to the owner for lost property, not justice for the victim. A thrall who kills a free person faces execution, but a free person who kills a thrall might pay a fine less than the cost of a decent horse. The legal system you are learning about at dinner explicitly values human beings on a sliding scale where some lives matter vastly more than others. Historians still argue about whether some thralls achieved relatively comfortable lives, citing examples of trusted slaves managing farms or handling complex tasks, but these exceptional cases don't erase the fundamental injustice of the system. The thrall who manages a farm still doesn't own it, can still be sold regardless of their competence, still watches their children grow up in bondage. Any comfort or responsibility granted to a thrall serves the owner's interests first, the thrall's humanity only coincidentally, if at all. You notice an older thrall, face scarred and body bent from decades of labour, and someone mentions he was once free, captured in a raid, enslaved as punishment for debt, or sold by relatives who needed resources, the specifics lost to time. The transition from free to unfree was possible in Viking society, a terrifying reality that makes the social hierarchies even more precarious. Maintain your status or risk losing everything, including your freedom, your identity, your very humanity in the eyes of law and custom. The fire burns lower, and thralls are dispatched to add fuel. Dung they collected, dried, and now feed into flames that warm the free household members primarily, while they themselves huddle in the coldest corners. The physical arrangement of the longhouse mirrors the social arrangement. Heat, light, comfort, and resources flowing to those with status, while the unfree make do with the margins, the scraps, the bare minimum necessary to keep them functional as labour units. A particularly disturbing conversation emerges about breeding. Yes, breeding, like livestock. Discussing which thralls might produce strong children if paired, which bloodlines seem to produce better workers. The same calculus farmers apply to sheep applied to human beings. Some households apparently encouraged thrall reproduction, seeing it as cheaper than purchasing new slaves. Others prevented it, not wanting to feed unproductive children for years before they became useful. The decisions were purely economic, reducing human sexuality and family formation to cost-benefit analysis. The evening wears on, and you're increasingly aware of your position in this moral nightmare. You're not a thrall. Your freedom, precarious as it is, separates you from that fate. But you're also not powerful enough to change anything, complicit through your dependence on the household's hospitality. You watch a thrall child being sent to sleep in the byre with the animals, too low in status to merit even the crowded sleeping platforms, and you're confronted with the reality that surviving Viking Iceland might require accepting atrocities you can't prevent, or actively participating in systems that violate everything you've been taught about human dignity. The household begins preparing for sleep, and the thralls undertake the final tasks, banking the fire to last through the night, checking the livestock, securing the door against wind and wandering animals. They work silently, efficiently, and you wonder what they think about their owners, about the free people who control every aspect of their existence. Do they hate you? Do they plot escape or revenge? Or have they internalized their status, accepted it as natural and inevitable, the way people can adapt to almost any circumstance given enough time and no alternative? As you settle onto your sleeping platform, a privilege denied to some thralls who sleep on the floor or with animals, you're forced to confront uncomfortable questions about survival and morality. To survive here means accepting slavery, infant exposure, and brutalities that your modern ethics condemn absolutely. But refusing to accept them means social ostracism, possible enslavement yourself, or death from being cast out of the community. Viking Iceland offers no clean choices, no ways to maintain moral purity while ensuring survival. You close your eyes, trying not to think about the thrall children sleeping in the cold, the infants exposed on hillsides, the system of casual cruelty that makes your continued existence possible. The settlement's dark secrets aren't secrets at all. They're the foundation on which this entire society rests, and you're lying on that foundation, complicit and contaminated, just trying to survive one more day in a place where humanity seems to have very specific, very limited definitions. Morning arrives far too soon, and you're roused for the journey to the Thing assembly. But first comes the brutal reality of working Iceland's volcanic landscape, a terrain that seems specifically designed to injure, maim, or kill anyone foolish enough to try farming it. Before you can attend any legal proceedings, there are fields to tend, and you're about to discover that Icelandic soil isn't really soil at all, but a thin layer of organic matter, barely covering an apocalyptic foundation of volcanic rock, lava fields, and geological hostility that makes agriculture less a profession and more an act of defiant optimism. You're handed tools, a wooden spade with an iron tip, precious metal that represents significant investment, and directed toward the barley field that needs final preparation before winter. The moment you drive the spade into the ground, you understand the problem. 6 inches down, you hit rock. Not scattered stones that can be removed, but solid volcanic substrate that turns farming into mining, each furrow requiring you to chip and lever and curse your way through stone that has no business being where topsoil should exist. The historical fact is that Iceland's soil is geologically infant, formed from volcanic ash and slowly decomposing vegetation, with an average depth of maybe 8 to 12 inches before you encounter the basalt bedrock that defines the island's foundation. Your progress is measured in feet per hour rather than acres per day. Each thrust of the spade either bounces off hidden rock or sinks into a pocket of ash that offers no resistance, making consistent work impossible. You're sweating despite the cold, your shoulders screaming from the jarring impacts when metal meets stone, your hands developing new blisters on top of the previous day's barely healed wounds. Meanwhile, experienced farmers work around you with techniques refined over generations. They read the landscape, knowing where pockets of deeper soil exist, where lava formations lie just beneath the surface waiting to destroy tools and spirits alike. The volcanic rock itself comes in varieties that you're learning to distinguish through painful experience. There's the smooth, ropey Pahoeho lava that at least offers some predictability, its surface weathered into formations you can sometimes navigate around. Then there's the A'a lava, a Hawaiian term, but the phenomenon is universal, consisting of sharp, jagged clinkers that will shred your shoes, slice your hands, and make walking across fields an exercise in avoiding injury. Hidden beneath the grass are lava tubes, collapsed sections that create sudden drops or unstable ground that can swallow a foot, twist an ankle or break a leg if you're unlucky enough to step wrong. Historians still argue about how Vikings managed to farm Iceland at all, and standing here in this field you're beginning to wonder the same thing. The growing season is perhaps 90 days in a good year, the soil is minimal and nutrient poor, the weather is actively hostile, and the very ground fights every attempt at cultivation. Yet somehow, medieval Icelanders grew enough barley to brew ale, bake bread, and maintain a population, creating surplus sufficient to support non-farming specialists like the law speakers and skalds. The answer you're discovering is work. Endless, brutal, back-breaking work that makes modern farming seem almost leisurely by comparison. You're shown the household's precious barley crop, and it's pathetic by modern standards. Stunted plants barely knee-high, growing in scattered patches where soil depth permits. The whole field looking more like a poorly maintained lawn than agricultural enterprise. But this represents the household's grain supply for the entire year. The source of bread and ale, the buffer between subsistence and starvation. Every plant matters, every grain head is precious, and the labour invested in nursing this crop through Iceland's hostile growing season staggers your imagination. The irrigation system, such as it exists, relies on channeling glacial melt through hand-dug ditches that constantly collapse or fill with volcanic ash. You're assigned to clearing one such channel, and the work is Sisyphean, You dig out ash and debris only to have more wash in with the next rain. The water itself is so cold it numbs your hands within seconds, and so silty with suspended volcanic particles that it turns the ditches into grey slurries that splatter your clothing and work their way into every crevice of your body. Vikings accepted this as normal, the price of obtaining water for crops that barely tolerate Iceland's climate anyway. The quirky truth is that Icelanders became experts at finding and exploiting every possible growing location, creating a patchwork of tiny cultivation zones scattered across the landscape wherever conditions permitted. A south-facing slope with an extra hour of sun? Plant barley there. A spot where geothermal heat warms the soil slightly. Claim it and guard it jealously. A depression where organic matter accumulated to unusual depth. Make it a garden patch and defend your ownership through legal and physical means if necessary. Viking Age. Iceland had no large contiguous fields, but instead thousands of tiny plots, each representing hours of labour to create and maintain. You're working near what appears to be solid ground when someone shouts a warning. You've wandered close to a kettle hole, a depression created when buried ice from the last glaciation finally melted, leaving an unstable area that looks safe but can collapse without warning. These geological traps dot the landscape, invisible to untrained eyes, waiting to injure the unwary. You step back carefully, newly aware that the very ground is treacherous, that walking across seemingly solid terrain requires constant vigilance and knowledge, accumulated through generations of trial, error, and occasional tragic failure. The lava fields beyond the cultivated areas stretch toward the horizon, vast expanses of tortured rock where nothing grows except hardy mosses that create a deceptively soft-looking surface. You're warned never to walk on this moss. It's fragile, and beneath it lie sharp lava formations that will tear your feet to shreds if you break through. Some lava fields are centuries old, weathered enough to support minimal vegetation. Others are recent enough that the rock is still raw, black and utterly sterile, monuments to Iceland's ongoing geological violence. Historians still argue about how many eruptions occurred during the Viking Age, but the consensus is that medieval Icelanders witnessed multiple major events, watching their adopted homeland literally reshape itself through volcanic fury. You notice strange mounds in the distance, pseudo-craters formed when lava flowed over wetlands, causing steam explosions that created crater-like formations without actual volcanic vents. These dot the landscape like scars from some giant's acne, each one a reminder that Iceland was and is a work in progress, a land still being formed by forces that dwarf human concerns. Vikings built around these geological oddities, incorporating them into their mental maps and mythology, turning dangerous landscape features into landmarks and sometimes sacred sites. The wind picks up and suddenly you're in a sandstorm. Not sand as you know it, but volcanic ash so fine it penetrates your clothing, works its way into your eyes and mouth, and turns the air into an abrasive haze that makes breathing difficult and visions nearly impossible. These ash storms occur regularly when wind crosses the volcanic deserts inland, picking up particles and flinging them across the island with enough force to strip paint from modern vehicles. Vikings endured these storms with no protection except turning their backs and waiting for the wind to shift, accepting temporary blindness and respiratory distress as just another hazard of Icelandic existence. When the ash clears, you're coated in grey dust that makes you look like a ghost, and you understand why the household's textiles all tend toward muted, earth-tone colours. Bright dyes would be pointless when volcanic ash constantly recolours everything to shades of grey and black. You try to brush off the ash, but it's mixed with the fish oil in your clothing, creating a paste that spreads rather than removes. And you resign yourself to carrying this layer of volcanic grime until the next rare bathing opportunity. The morning's agricultural work reveals the desperate measures Vikings employed to make farming viable. They built low stone walls to protect plants from wind, creating microclimates that might add a few degrees of warmth or reduce desiccation enough to matter. They composted everything organic, including human waste, seaweed and animal remains, desperately trying to build soil depth that nature refused to provide. They rotated tiny plots between barley and hay, letting some fields lie fallow in hopes they'd recover enough nutrients for the next planting. Every technique was marginal, offering small improvements in a fundamentally hostile environment. But collectively, these margins spell the difference between survival and starvation. You're pulling rocks from a field, a never-ending task because frost heave brings new stones to the surface every winter. When you uncover something interesting, a small carved stone, possibly a property marker or ritual object, lost decades or centuries ago and now emerging from the volcanic soil. These archaeological moments happen regularly in Iceland, where the thin soil and constant erosion expose artifacts with casual frequency. You're told to toss it on the rock pile. Whatever historical significance it might have is irrelevant compared to the need to clear the field for planting. Vikings weren't sentimental about their own past, focused entirely on the immediate challenges of the present. The household's hay meadows are another revelation in agricultural desperation. These aren't planted, but rather wild grasslands managed through careful grazing and occasional burning, encouraging the right species while suppressing less useful plants. The hay quality varies enormously. Some meadows produce decent fodder, others yield coarse material barely suitable for bedding, but all of it gets harvested because winter is long and animals must eat. You're shown how to judge grass by feel and smell, determining which areas to cut first and which to leave longer, a complex calculus that you have no hope of mastering in a single season, let alone a single day. As morning advances toward the time you must leave for the thing assembly, you take one last look at the fields you've been working. They look barely touched despite hours of brutal labour, the rocks still numerous, the soil still shallow, the crops still stunted and struggling. This is Iceland's cruel joke. Immense effort produces minimal results, yet stopping the effort produces death. Vikings who farmed this land weren't heroes or adventurers but desperate survivors, wringing subsistence from geology that offered nothing freely, building an entire society on margins so thin that one bad harvest, one volcanic eruption, one harsh winter could erase generations of progress. You're exhausted, your hands are bleeding, your back feels permanently damaged, and you've barely made a dent in the work that needs doing. But there's no time for rest. The thing assembly awaits, and you must somehow clean up enough to be presentable while your body screams for mercy, and the volcanic landscape watches with its ancient indifferent patience. As twilight descends, or what passes for it in Iceland's perpetual dimness, you're finally released from field work to prepare for the thing assembly. But the encroaching darkness brings its own terrors that go far beyond simple absence of light. Night in Viking Iceland isn't just dark, it's actively hostile, a time when every danger intensifies, when the landscape transforms from merely difficult to genuinely lethal, and when the thin veneer of human control over this environment vanishes entirely into the consuming blackness that swallows the world for months at a time. The household begins its evening preparations with ritualistic urgency, everyone moving faster as the light fails, because being caught outside after full dark isn't just inconvenient, it's potentially fatal. You're helping secure the livestock, driving the sheep closer to the longhouse, when you notice how the temperature plummets the moment the sun's pathetic warmth disappears below the horizon. Within minutes, the cold intensifies from uncomfortable to dangerous, the wind seemingly gaining strength as if darkness empowers it, and your breath creates clouds so thick you can barely see through them in the fading light. The historical fact is that Iceland's winter darkness is profound in ways that temperate regions never experience. At this latitude, December brings only 4 hours of weak daylight, and even that is often obscured by clouds and storms that turn midday into twilight. Vikings navigated this darkness for months every year, their entire society adapting to function in conditions where seeing your hand in front of your face was impossible without firelight, where stepping outside meant entering a void so complete that direction, distance, and even the boundary between earth and sky became guesswork. You're handed a primitive lantern, basically a soapstone vessel filled with fish oil and a twisted wool wick, and told this must last the entire evening, because oil is precious and waste is unforgivable. The light it produces is pathetic. A flickering yellow glow that extends perhaps 3 feet before being swallowed by darkness so absolute it feels solid, like you could reach out and touch the black. Modern people talk about darkness metaphorically. Vikings experienced it as a physical presence, an entity that pressed against firelight boundaries and waited patiently for flames to fail. Someone mentions, with the casual tone reserved for everyday dangers, that polar bears sometimes wander across from Greenland on ice floes, landing on Iceland's northern coast and then moving inland in search of food. At night, in the darkness, such a bear could approach within yards before anyone noticed, and the household's sheep would be easy prey, assuming the bear didn't decide humans were worth investigating. Historians still argue about how frequently polar bears reached Iceland during the medieval period, but enough accounts exist in the sagas to suggest it was regular enough to warrant concern, another predator added to the list of nighttime threats. The quirky and terrifying truth is that Vikings believed nighttime belonged to other things, not just animals, but supernatural entities that the darkness made more powerful. The household's children are called inside with genuine urgency, and you hear warnings about the utiseta, the practice of sitting outside at night that was associated with sorcery and communicating with dangerous spirits. Whether these beliefs reflected actual supernatural threats or were practical warnings disguised as superstition doesn't matter. The effect is the same. Nighttime is when humans retreat to their shelters and hope the doors hold against whatever moves in the darkness. You help secure the longhouse door, a process more complex than simply closing it. The door must be barred from inside with a heavy timber, wedges driven into gaps where wind might penetrate, and the threshold checked for any openings large enough for something to enter. The household treats this with deadly seriousness, and you notice they avoid discussing what exactly they're securing against, as if naming nighttime dangers might invite their attention. Modern skeptics might dismiss this as superstition, but standing in the gathering dark of a Viking Age Icelandic night, rationality feels like a luxury of well-lit civilizations. The livestock secured in the byre are restless, sensing something in the darkness that you can't perceive. Horses particularly are agitated, stamping and snorting, their eyes rolling white in the lamplight. Vikings trusted animal senses more than human reason when it came to detecting nighttime threats. If the horses were nervous, there was probably cause. You peer out into the darkness beyond your small circle of light and see nothing, which is somehow more disturbing than seeing something definite. The unknown is always worse, and Iceland's night offers nothing but unknown in every direction. Inside the longhouse, the evening routine has a claustrophobic quality, now that outside has become forbidden territory. The fire is built higher. Damn the fuel cost. Darkness demands light, and people cluster closer together as if proximity to others provides protection beyond mere warmth. Stories begin, but these aren't the heroic sagas from dinner. These are darker tales of Draugr, undead creatures who walk at night, and Hulderfolk, hidden people who emerge when humans should be sleeping. Whether anyone truly believes these stories is unclear, but they serve a purpose, reinforcing the message that nighttime is dangerous, that staying inside is wise, that respecting the darkness's dominion is simple survival sense. The wind outside intensifies, and you hear it howling around the longhouse with a sound that's almost vocal, almost like voices or screaming or something that might be either or neither. Vikings heard these sounds every winter night and wove them into their mythology. The wild hunt, supernatural riders chasing souls through the storm, or the ghosts of those who died badly, unable to rest, wandering the darkness in perpetual agony. Modern meteorology explains these sounds as simple wind effects, air moving around structures and through landscape features, creating acoustic phenomena that mimic voices. But explanation doesn't make the sounds less unsettling, especially when you're huddled in a turf house with only fire between you and the consuming night. Someone tells a story about a neighbouring farm where a man ignored the darkness rules, going outside on a winter night to check on livestock. He was found the next morning frozen solid, his face locked in an expression of such terror that people whispered he'd seen something before the cold took him. Whether this story is true, exaggerated, or entirely fictional doesn't matter. It reinforces the community understanding that night in Iceland is genuinely dangerous, that respecting its boundaries is essential for survival, and that the consequences of ignoring these rules are severe and final. The household's sleeping arrangements become more compressed at night, people clustering closer than strictly necessary, children tucked between adults, even the thralls brought nearer to the fire's protective circle. This isn't just about warmth, though the temperature outside has dropped to genuinely life-threatening levels, but about something more primal, the human instinct to gather together when darkness brings threats that individual courage cannot confront. You find yourself pressed against strangers, sharing body heat and perhaps sharing something more fundamental, the acknowledgement that humans are small, vulnerable, and that night in this place belongs to forces that don't recognize human dominance. The fire becomes the center of existence, a small sphere of light and warmth against the overwhelming darkness and cold pressing from all directions. You watch the flames with the intensity of someone whose life depends on them, which here it does. If the fire dies, the longhouse becomes a tomb, cold infiltrating within hours, the darkness creeping in to claim the space that firelight barely holds. Vikings assigned fire-watching duty throughout the night, rotating responsibility for keeping the flames alive, feeding fuel when needed, ensuring that the light never fails because failure means death comes creeping in on frozen feet. Historians still argue about the psychological effects of spending months in near darkness, the seasonal affective disorder that must have plagued Viking-age Icelanders, the depression and despair that long winter nights must have induced. You're experiencing just one evening of this darkness, and already you can feel it pressing on your psyche, the absence of light creating a void that seems to extend beyond the physical into something emotional, spiritual, a darkness of the soul that matches the darkness of the world. How Vikings endured 4 or 5 months of this annually, without modern understanding of mental health or treatment, is simultaneously impressive and tragic. The household's evening activities are constrained by the darkness and a need to conserve lamp oil. There's some textile work by firelight, spinning, the simplest weaving, but detailed tasks are impossible in the flickering illumination that creates more shadows than visibility. Mostly people just sit telling stories, maintaining the fire, waiting for sleep to claim them and morning to return them to a world where humans can at least see their enemies and challenges. The boredom must have been crushing. Winter nights stretching 16 or 18 hours, filled with nothing but darkness, cold, stories you've heard 1,000 times, and the constant awareness of how thin the barriers are between your survival and the void outside. Someone starts crying, a child, overwhelmed by the darkness, the confinement, the oppressive awareness of the night beyond the walls. The sound is quickly hushed, not harshly but urgently, because loud noises at night are unwise. What might hear them? What might respond? Better to endure in silence, to teach even children that night demands quiet respect, that attracting attention when darkness rules is foolish beyond measure. The child's sobs subside into quiet whimpering, and you feel the collective relief. Another potential danger avoided, another night navigating the unspoken rules that keep the household safe. You try to sleep, but the darkness beyond the fire's small circle feels present, alive, watching. Every sound outside, wind, an animal, shifting ice or something else, triggers alertness, your body refusing to fully relax in an environment that screams danger to every evolutionary instinct humans possess. Vikings learned to sleep through this, to trust the door and the fire and the presence of others, but you're new to this terror, and sleep feels like vulnerability, like dropping your guard when predators, natural or supernatural, real or imagined, prowl the darkness beyond the fragile boundaries of firelight and turf walls. The night stretches ahead, hours and hours of darkness that feels eternal, and you understand viscerally why Vikings developed such elaborate rules around nighttime behaviour, why their mythology filled darkness with monsters and malevolent entities, why they treated night not as the simple absence of day but as something actively hostile, a force to be respected, feared, and survived until morning brings its weak but precious light back to the world. You close your eyes, trying to rest, but the darkness presses against your eyelids, and somewhere outside something moves through the night, wind, animal, or the restless dead, and you're left wondering if you'll survive until dawn to face the Thing Assembly and all its social dangers, assuming the night itself doesn't claim you first. Dawn finally arrives, a grudging grey lightening of the darkness rather than anything resembling sunrise, and the household emerges from the longhouse like survivors of a siege, which in many ways they are. Today is the Thing Assembly, and you're about to discover that Viking entertainment and supernatural beliefs are inseparable from the genuine terror that permeates every aspect of life in this isolated, harsh land. But first, there are morning preparations that reveal how deeply superstition and practicality intertwine in Viking culture, where every action might ward off evil or invite disaster, and nobody is quite sure which is which. Before leaving for the assembly, the household performs small rituals that blur the line between religion and survival strategy. Someone sprinkles water, the same water you'll drink later, in a pattern around the door, murmuring words that might be Christian prayer or older invocations. Nobody seems entirely certain. Iceland is in its religious transition period. Christianity officially adopted, but the old ways still lingering in practice, creating a hybrid belief system where you might pray to the Christian God while still leaving offerings for the landvættir, the land spirits who supposedly control local fortunes. Historians still argue about how sincere this religious mixing was versus simple hedging of supernatural bets, but standing here watching someone bless the threshold while wearing a Thor's hammer and a cross, you understand that Vikings weren't taking chances. If multiple gods might help, why not honour them all? The journey to the Thing assembly site covers several miles across terrain designed to kill the careless, and you travel in a group because going alone invites disaster, natural and otherwise. You notice people avoiding certain rocks, taking deliberate detours around formations that look identical to dozens of others. And when you ask why, you're told those are alpha dwellings, elf homes that must not be disturbed. The quirky truth is that many Icelanders still believe in hidden people today, and in Viking times this belief was essentially universal. Whether the elves were real or metaphorical warnings about dangerous landscape features doesn't matter. The result is the same. You walk carefully, respectfully, avoiding actions that might anger beings whose existence is uncertain, but whose revenge is described in vivid, terrifying detail. You pass a place where the land simply stops, a cliff edge dropping hundreds of feet to rocks and ocean below, and someone mentions casually that a woman jumped here last winter, driven mad by the darkness, the isolation, or possibly by elves who lured her to destruction. The story is told without judgment, just acceptance that such things happen, that Iceland's landscape and spiritual ecology includes spaces where humans shouldn't go, times when they shouldn't travel, and moments when the barriers between worlds thin enough that crossing over becomes possible, usually fatal. Modern psychology might diagnose seasonal affective disorder or psychotic breaks, but Vikings understood these tragedies through their own framework of supernatural interference and human vulnerability to forces beyond comprehension. The Thing assembly site emerges from the landscape, not a building but a natural amphitheatre of sorts, where rocky outcroppings provide seating and a flat area serves as the speaking ground. People are already gathering, and you notice immediately that this is theatre as much as legal proceeding, with families displaying their strength through numbers, their wealth through clothing and weapons, their status through positioning within the crowd. The historical fact is that thing assemblies served multiple purposes. Legal courts, yes, but also social gatherings, marriage markets, trading fairs, and entertainment venues where Vikings who spent months in isolated farmsteads could reconnect with the broader community and remember they were part of something larger than individual survival. The entertainment begins even before the formal proceedings. Wrestling matches between young men proving their strength, horse fights that draw betting and passionate partisan support, and storytelling competitions where skalds demonstrate their craft. You watch two horses being driven against each other, stallions maddened by the scent of mares and the prodding of their handlers, biting and kicking in a spectacle that's simultaneously impressive and disturbing. The horses sometimes die from these fights, and occasionally the human spectators do too, when arguments over outcomes escalate to violence. This passes for fun in Viking Iceland, where entertainment, like everything else, carries genuine risk of injury or death. A skald takes the speaking stone, literally a prominent rock that serves as the speaker's platform, and begins a poem about last summer's successful raid on Irish monasteries. The verses glorify violence in language so beautiful it's almost obscene, describing burning buildings and fleeing monks with the same aesthetic appreciation modern poets might reserve for sunsets or romance. The crowd responds with appreciation, some people literally pounding their shields in approval, because this skald has captured the Viking ideal. Violence as art form, destruction as achievement, the suffering of others transformed through poetry into entertainment for those who inflicted it. Historians still argue about how much Vikings actually enjoyed violence versus performing enjoyment because their culture demanded it. But watching the crowd's reaction to tales of slaughter, you realise the distinction might be meaningless. Whether the enjoyment is authentic or performed, the result is a society that celebrates brutality, that finds entertainment in recounting how they devastated foreign communities, that bonds over shared appreciation of their ancestors' capacity for inflicting harm. You force yourself to nod along, to show appropriate appreciation, because failing to enjoy the skald's performance would mark you as weak, possibly disloyal, certainly strange. The supernatural intrudes even into daylight entertainment when someone begins a ghost story. A man who died unavenged and now walks as a draugr, crushing livestock and terrifying his former household until they exhumed and burned his body. The story is told with the same matter-of-fact tone as the legal proceedings that follow, as if undead corpses animated by rage are simply another category of problem requiring practical solutions. The crowd listens with rapt attention, and you can't tell if they believe it literally or enjoy it as fiction, but you notice people glancing nervously at shadows despite the daylight, as if the story alone might summon what it describes. The formal legal proceedings begin, and the driftwood dispute unfolds with all the drama of a theatrical performance. The farmers present their cases with flowery language and legal technicalities that would impress modern lawyers, but underneath the sophisticated arguments is the constant threat of violence. Weapons are displayed openly, not drawn, but prominently worn, as reminders that legal solutions are preferred but not required, that any verdict can be contested through combat if one party finds the ruling unacceptable. This is justice theatre, where right and might are in constant negotiation, and the outcome depends as much on the number of armed supporters each side brought as on the merits of their arguments. The quirky and disturbing truth is that thing assemblies sometimes erupted into battles when legal arguments failed to satisfy all parties. The sagas describe assemblies where dozens died, where legal disputes escalated into pitched warfare, where the thing site itself became a battlefield soaked with blood that was supposed to be settled peacefully through law. The threat of such violence hangs over every proceeding, adding dramatic tension to what might otherwise be dry legal technicalities about boundary markers and tide lines. You're called as a witness. Remember, you're supposed to support your household's claim, and you stumble through testimony that's clearly rehearsed by others but which you barely understand. You state that yes, you saw the household head mark the driftwood first, even though you weren't present and have no idea if this is true. Lying under oath would normally trouble you, but in Viking Iceland, loyalty trumps honesty, and your testimony isn't about truth, but about supporting your household's position in a social and legal theatre where everyone understands the performance requirements. The opposing side doesn't even challenge your obvious fabrication. They have their own false witnesses ready to counter your claims, creating a legal proceeding where truth is negotiable and credibility depends entirely on social standing. Between testimonies, there's more entertainment. A comedian of sorts, though his humour is dark, often cruel, mocking physical deformities and social failures in ways that make you uncomfortable but which draw roaring laughter from the crowd. Vikings found humour in suffering, in others' misfortunes, in the kind of jokes that would be considered bullying or harassment in modern contexts, but which here serve as social bonding through shared cruelty. You force yourself to laugh at a joke about a widow's poverty, about a cripple's struggles, about a thrall's stupidity, because not laughing would separate you from the group, mark you as humourless, possibly weak. The assembly continues through the day, legal cases alternating with entertainment, supernatural stories mixed with practical discussions of grazing rights and inheritance disputes. Someone mentioned seeing lights in the mountains, Alphard dancing, or perhaps the souls of the dead, or maybe just unusual aurora displays, but interpreted through a framework where supernatural explanation is as valid as natural phenomena. The boundaries between entertainment, legal proceeding, religious observance and social gathering blur completely, creating an event that serves all purposes simultaneously while maintaining the constant undercurrent of potential violence that makes everything feel slightly dangerous, slightly unpredictable. As the assembly winds toward conclusion, you realise you've witnessed something alien to modern sensibilities, a society where law, entertainment, supernatural belief and violence exist in a complex equilibrium, where people gather to settle disputes but also to tell ghost stories, to judge legal cases but also to watch horses fight, to perform religious rituals but also to celebrate ancestors who burned monasteries. Vikings didn't separate these aspects of life into distinct categories. Justice, fun, spirituality and brutality were all part of a single social fabric, woven together so tightly that pulling one thread would unravel everything. The driftwood case is decided. Your household wins, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly given the number of armed supporters they brought, and everyone pretends the verdict was based on legal merit rather than implicit threats. The losing farmer accepts with poor grace but acceptance nonetheless, calculating that the cost of challenging the verdict through violence would exceed the value of one log, regardless of principle. This is Viking justice, not blind but acutely aware of power dynamics, not pure but practical, not idealistic but realistic about how societies function when legal authority lacks enforcement mechanisms beyond the willingness of individuals to accept outcomes they don't like. As you prepare to leave the assembly, someone starts singing, a beautiful, haunting melody about winter darkness, isolation, and the longing for spring that may never come. The song is melancholy, bordering on despairing, yet people join in, hundreds of voices unified in acknowledging their shared misery, their collective struggle against a land and climate that seems designed to crush human spirit. This, too, is Viking entertainment, finding beauty in suffering, transforming hardship into art, creating community through shared acknowledgement of how difficult existence is and how uncertain survival remains. You join the singing, your voice cracking with exhaustion and emotion, and for a moment you feel connected to these people, these impossible survivors who found ways to laugh, love, fight, and create meaning in a place that offers nothing but challenges and the vague possibility that tomorrow might not kill you. The return journey from the Thing assembly coincides with the day's final descent toward darkness. and you're about to face the most fundamental challenge of Viking Iceland: sleep, or rather, the near impossibility of achieving anything resembling restful sleep in conditions that violate every principle of comfort your modern body expects. As the household trudges back across the darkening landscape, you're already dreading the night ahead, knowing that the sleeping arrangements make medieval torture devices seem merciful by comparison, and that tomorrow you'll be expected to work with the same brutal efficiency, despite having rested about as well as someone trying to sleep on a pile of rocks during an earthquake. You enter the longhouse as full darkness descends, and the sleeping preparations begin with the efficiency born of desperate routine. The sleeping platforms you noticed earlier, those raised benches built into the walls, are about to become your bed, and bed is an optimistic term for what's essentially a wooden shelf covered with materials that generations of marketing couldn't honestly describe as comfortable. Your designated spot is perhaps 6 feet long and 2 feet wide, a space that would be cramped for sleeping alone, but which you're about to discover you won't be occupying alone. The historical fact is that Vikings slept communally, not just in the same room, but often in the same bed, piling multiple bodies onto each sleeping platform to share warmth in a climate where individual sleeping arrangements would mean freezing to death. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. You'd be sleeping pressed against strangers, sharing their body heat, breathing their exhalations, listening to their snores, and hoping that whatever parasites they're hosting don't migrate to you during the night. Though that's probably wishful thinking. The bedding materials are laid out. First, a layer of straw directly on the wooden platform, creating minimal cushioning while also creating habitat for the fleas, lice and other parasites that consider the longhouse their territory as much as the humans do. Over this goes a woolen blanket, rough woven and scratchy, that serves as both mattress and bottom sheet. Then come the sleeping furs and more wool blankets for covering, each one carrying the distinctive smell of the animal it came from mixed with the accumulated scent of every human who's slept under it previously. The whole arrangement weighs probably 50 pounds and provides insulation that's crucial for survival but comfort that's entirely coincidental. You climb onto your assigned platform and immediately 3 other people join you. You're sleeping 4 across on a space designed for maybe 2 modern humans with personal space expectations. There's an older man who immediately claims the wall side, considered the best position because the wall provides something to lean against and blocks some draft. Next to him, a teenage boy settles in with the practiced efficiency of someone who's done this thousands of times. You're placed third, and on your outside a woman arranges herself, completing the human sardine arrangement that will be your sleeping situation until morning. The quirky and horrible truth is that this arrangement, while cramped and uncomfortable, was actually effective at preventing death by hypothermia. 4 bodies generate significant heat, and the mass of wool and fur covering you creates an insulation layer that traps this warmth. Vikings understood thermodynamics instinctively even without the scientific vocabulary. Bodies together survive, bodies alone freeze. But understanding the necessity doesn't make the reality any more pleasant, as you feel the stranger beside you shift, their elbow digging into your ribs, their foot somehow ending up near your face, despite the geometry suggesting this should be impossible. The sleeping positions require negotiation, because rolling over is impossible without coordinating with your sleeping partners. If one person needs to turn, everyone must turn together in a synchronized movement that Vikings probably learned in childhood but which you have to figure out through awkward trial and error. The man by the wall grunts instructions. When he shifts, everyone shifts, moving as a unit because individual movement in these cramped quarters just creates more discomfort for everyone. You try it, the 4 of you rolling in unison like some bizarre human log. And it works, sort of, though the coordination required means you're constantly aware of your sleeping partners. never quite achieving the unconscious rest that real sleep requires. The platform itself is unforgiving, the wooden surface barely padded by the thin layer of straw and wool, creating pressure points wherever your body contacts it. Your hip starts aching almost immediately, then your shoulder, then your knee, a rotating chorus of discomfort that makes finding any position tolerable for more than a few minutes impossible. Historians still argue about whether Vikings simply had higher pain tolerance, or if they were as miserable as you're currently feeling but just accepted it as the unchangeable reality of existence. Either way, you're discovering that sleeping on a Viking-age bed platform is less like resting and more like enduring a night-long session of mild physical torture. The sounds are overwhelming. Not just the household's various sleepers snoring, coughing, and making other nocturnal noises, but the animals in the byre just a few yards away, contributing their own symphony of grunts, bleats, and mysterious thumps that keep you startling awake just as sleep begins to claim you. The sheep seem particularly active, their bells jingling as they shift position, and you wonder if they sleep any better than the humans, or if this whole household, human and animal alike, spends nights in collective exhausted wakefulness, waiting for dawn to justify giving up on sleep entirely. The woman sleeping on your outside edge begins snoring almost immediately, a rattling, gasping sound that suggests respiratory issues that won't be diagnosed or treated because Viking-age Iceland has no medical care beyond folk remedies and hope. Her snoring triggers the boy to shift uncomfortably, which forces you to move, which disturbs the man by the wall, who grunts in annoyance and punches the platform in frustration, which somehow is interpreted as a signal for everyone to roll over in unison again. You're learning that sleep in Viking Iceland is a group activity requiring coordination and tolerance that modern solo sleepers can barely imagine. The temperature is another constant battle. The fire in the main hall provides some warmth, but it's 15 feet away and the air temperature drops dramatically with distance. Under the pile of furs and blankets you're warm, almost too warm, your body generating sweat that soaks into the wool and creates dampness that will become clammy coldness by morning. But exposing any part of your body to the air means immediate cold shock. Your face is the only part uncovered, and even that's positioned to breathe the slightly warmer air trapped under the blankets, creating a pocket of recycled breath that's simultaneously necessary for warmth and disgusting for hygiene. You desperately need to urinate. The bland and ale from dinner are making their presence known, but the prospect of climbing over your sleeping partners, navigating the dark longhouse to find the door, going outside into the freezing night to relieve yourself, then returning and disturbing everyone again to reclaim your spot seems overwhelming. Vikings must have developed bladder control capacities that modern plumbing has allowed us to lose, because no one else seems bothered. Or perhaps they're just better at suffering in silence. Or maybe they simply use chamber pots that you haven't been shown and will discover tomorrow through unfortunate accident. The straw bedding rustles with movement that isn't human, the parasites are active, and you feel the distinctive crawling sensation of something small moving across your skin. Fleas, almost certainly, and probably lice, the constant companions of medieval life that no amount of the household's marginal hygiene practices can truly eliminate. Vikings lived with parasites the way modern people live with dust. Annoying but unavoidable, part of the background reality of existence. You try not to think about what's biting you, what's laying eggs in your clothing and hair, what you're sharing with your sleeping partners beyond body heat and breath. The psychological weight of the darkness presses down almost physically. The longhouse's interior is absolutely black except for the fire's faint glow, and lying in this darkness, unable to sleep, you feel the isolation and foreignness of your situation acutely. These people around you are strangers. Their language is barely comprehensible, their customs are alien, and you're trapped here, pressed between their bodies in the dark, trying to rest in conditions that make rest nearly impossible, knowing that tomorrow brings more brutal labour that your exhausted body won't be ready to perform. Someone in another sleeping platform is crying. quiet, suppressed sobs that suggest they're trying not to disturb others but can't quite contain their misery. No one responds or offers comfort. Crying yourself to sleep is apparently common enough to not warrant attention, just another sound in the longhouse's nighttime acoustic landscape. You wonder if you're the only one lying awake, or if half the household is similarly struggling with discomfort, cold, parasites, and the crushing weight of another day survived and another night to endure before facing tomorrow's challenges. Historians still argue about sleep patterns in medieval societies, with some suggesting that segmented sleep, two distinct periods separated by a wakeful interval, was normal before artificial lighting changed human rhythms. Lying here in the darkness, unable to achieve continuous rest, you understand how this might have developed not as a choice but as an adaptation to sleeping conditions that made 8 continuous hours impossible. Perhaps Vikings slept in shifts, rested in intervals, accepted that sleep would be fragmented and simply structured their expectations around this reality. The night stretches endlessly, each hour feeling like 3, your body simultaneously exhausted and unable to relax, your mind racing despite desperate desire for unconsciousness. You drift in and out of something approximating sleep, never quite achieving the deep rest that restores and rejuvenates, always partly aware of the discomfort, the cold, the proximity of others, the sounds of the household and animals, the knowledge that this is just one night of thousands that Vikings endured, that this is considered normal, acceptable, simply the way life is when survival takes precedence over comfort. Finally, mercifully, exhaustion overwhelms discomfort, and you slip into something resembling actual sleep, though your dreams are troubled. Confused images of volcanic landscapes, legal disputes, supernatural threats, all the day's experiences processing through your unconscious mind, while your body tries desperately to extract whatever rest it can from these impossible conditions. When you wake, and you will wake multiple times before morning finally arrives, you'll be unrested, aching, covered in mysterious bites, and expected to perform another full day of back-breaking labour. This is Viking sleep. Not refreshing rest, but mere survival of the night. The minimum recovery necessary to stumble through another day in a place where even sleep is a trial to be endured, rather than a comfort to be enjoyed. Morning arrives not with the relief you'd hoped for, but with the crushing realization that you've survived approximately 1 full day in Viking Iceland, and you're already broken, physically, mentally, and spiritually exhausted in ways that no amount of sleep on a crowded wooden platform could remedy. As the household stirs around you, bodies disentangling from the communal sleeping arrangement, you take stock of your condition and understand with perfect clarity why you, a modern human, would absolutely not survive in this place, this time, this impossibly harsh existence that Vikings somehow endured for generations. Your body is a comprehensive catalogue of injuries and ailments that would send you to multiple medical specialists in the modern world. Your hands are raw and bleeding, blisters upon blisters from tools you don't know how to use properly, the skin cracked and infected looking despite the household's minimal attempts at bandaging. Your back screams with every movement, muscles strained by labour patterns your sedentary modern life never prepared you for, vertebrae compressed by lifting, bending, and carrying loads that exceed any reasonable expectation. Your feet are a disaster. Blisters from the ill-fitting leather shoes, potential frostbite damage from the kelp harvesting, and a pervasive ache that suggests you've done something structurally damaging that will require modern orthopedics to correct, assuming you ever escape this medieval nightmare. The historical fact is that Viking-age skeletons show evidence of constant physical trauma, compressed spines, worn joints, healed fractures, and arthritis developing in people who by modern standards would be considered young. The work demanded by survival in Iceland destroyed bodies systematically, grinding down even the strongest individuals through relentless physical demands that never ceased, never allowed recovery, just accumulated damage year after year until the body simply gave out, usually by age 50 if you were lucky, often much earlier if you weren't. You're also comprehensively filthy in ways that go beyond simple dirt. The fish oil in your clothing has mixed with sweat, volcanic ash, animal waste and wood smoke to create a coating that feels almost alive on your skin, a biological film that no amount of the household's minimal washing would remove. Your hair is matted, probably hosting lice that you can feel crawling when you pay attention, though you've learned not to pay attention because acknowledging the parasites makes them somehow worse. Your teeth feel coated with something unpleasant. Your breath probably rivals the Hakal for pure offensive power, and you've stopped noticing your own smell, which suggests you've crossed some threshold of filthiness that your olfactory system simply surrendered to, rather than continue reporting. The psychological damage might be worse than the physical. You've witnessed slavery, infant exposure, and casual brutality that your modern ethics condemn absolutely. Yet you've been complicit through simple survival necessity, unable to object without risking your own safety. You've lied under oath, supported false claims, and participated in a legal system that values power over justice, all because refusing would mark you as outsider, as threat, as someone who doesn't belong in this community that's grudgingly sheltering you. The moral compromises required for survival in Viking Iceland are profound, eroding the ethical foundations that civilization spent centuries building, reducing you to the simple arithmetic of staying alive regardless of the cost to your principles or your soul. Historians still argue about whether Vikings experienced moral distress over their society's practices, or if they simply accepted slavery, violence, and hardship as natural features of existence, requiring no justification or guilt. Standing here, exhausted and compromised, you understand that survival creates its own morality. When the alternative is death, almost anything becomes acceptable, almost any compromise justified, almost any degradation preferable to the finality of freezing, starving, or being cast out into the hostile landscape that surrounds the thin islands of human habitation. The quirky and devastating truth is that everything in Viking Iceland is harder than you imagine possible. Getting water requires a dangerous trek and constant vigilance against contamination. Staying warm means wearing pounds of scratchy wool infused with fish oil that makes you smell like a maritime disaster. Eating involves foods so aggressively preserved and fermented that they assault your palate with flavors evolution never prepared you to accept. Working means destroying your body through labor that would violate every modern workplace safety regulation ever conceived. Sleeping means huddling with strangers on wooden platforms while parasites feast on your blood and cold seeps through inadequate bedding. Even the simple act of existing requires constant effort, constant awareness, constant struggle against an environment that seems designed to kill humans and barely tolerates their presence. You stumble outside for morning ablutions and realize you can barely walk. Your legs are so stiff and sore that each step is agony. Your feet are probably damaged beyond what a single day's rest could heal, and you're moving like someone 3 times your age, hobbling and wincing with every movement. Vikings who survived to old age must have been in constant pain, their bodies broken by decades of this existence, held together by sheer stubborn refusal to die and the knowledge that stopping work meant starvation for themselves and their dependents. There was no retirement, no pension, no graceful aging. You worked until your body failed completely, then you became a burden the household might or might not choose to seem support, depending on resources and your past contributions to collective survival. The morning meal appears, more of the same aggressively terrible food from yesterday, and you realize you can't face it. The thought of choking down another bowl of smoky porridge, another piece of rock-hard stockfish, another cube of fermented shark makes your stomach rebel. But not eating isn't an option. You need the calories. Your body is desperately depleted, and refusing food would insult the household and raise questions about your fitness to remain in the community. You force it down, each bite a battle against your gag reflex, your modern palate in full revolt against the assault of fermented, smoked, and preserved foods that Vikings considered normal sustenance. The household is preparing for another day of brutal labour. The fields need work, the livestock need tending, the endless maintenance of survival in this harsh land continues regardless of your physical or emotional state. You're expected to participate, to contribute, to prove your worth to the household that's sheltering you despite your obvious incompetence. But as you try to grip a tool with your ruined hands, as you attempt to bend your damaged back, as you take a step on your injured feet, you realize the fundamental truth. You cannot do this. Not for another day. Certainly not for the weeks, months, years that survival would require. You're finished. Broken after barely 24 hours in a place where Vikings lived their entire lives. Everything you took for granted in modern life reveals itself as crucial. Medical care for injuries and illnesses that Vikings either survived or didn't. Climate control that maintains comfortable temperatures without constant fire tending and fuel gathering. Plumbing that provides clean water and sanitary waste disposal. Electric light that extends productive hours and banishes the terrifying darkness. Diverse, safe food that doesn't require you to develop a taste for putrefied shark. And perhaps most importantly, the absence of constant physical labour that destroys the body and spirit through sheer relentless demand. Vikings weren't superhuman. They were desperately ordinary humans trapped in extraordinary circumstances, doing whatever necessary to survive in conditions that killed the weak, the unlucky, and the insufficiently brutal. They developed remarkable adaptations, high pain tolerance, efficient movement patterns that conserved energy, social structures that distributed survival burdens, and psychological frameworks that made the unbearable seem normal. But these weren't superpowers. They were survival responses, often inadequate, frequently failing, producing a society where childhood mortality was horrific, where reaching age 50 was exceptional, where suffering was so universal that it became unremarkable. You look around the longhouse, at the people preparing for another day of survival, and you see them clearly now. Not romantic Vikings of saga and legend, but exhausted humans grinding through existence on the edge of sustainability, where one bad harvest, one harsh winter, one volcanic eruption could erase everything they've struggled to build. They're not thriving, they're enduring, accepting hardships that would break modern spirits because the alternative is death, and humans will tolerate almost anything if the only other option is non-existence. The verdict on your survival is clear. You wouldn't make it. Not through incompetence, though your modern skills are useless here, nor through weakness, though your body is soft compared to Viking standards. You'd fail because survival in this place requires accepting a quality of life so degraded, so constantly uncomfortable, so comprehensively difficult that maintaining the will to continue becomes the primary challenge. Vikings survived not because Iceland was tolerable, but because they had no choice, no escape, no alternative except to endure or die, and the human capacity for endurance, while impressive, is finite. As you stand there, broken and defeated after one day, you understand that Viking Iceland wasn't an adventure or a challenge to be overcome. It was a sustained ordeal that ground down even those born to it, that took extraordinary physical and psychological toll on every person, and that produced a society shaped entirely by the brutal demands of mere survival. The sagas celebrate heroes and battles, but the real Viking story is grimmer. Ordinary people suffering extraordinary hardships, dying young from accumulated damage, accepting brutalities that modern ethics condemn, all to maintain precarious existence on an island that nature never intended to support human civilization. Do you remember the morning's first moments, when you woke in darkness to sounds of animals and smells of dung smoke? That was the best moment of your Viking day before the labour began, before the injuries accumulated, before you fully understood the depth of suffering required just to survive until tomorrow. Each subsequent hour revealed new challenges, new pains, new ways that Viking Iceland was designed to kill humans, and you failed them all. Not through lack of trying, but through being fundamentally unsuited to existence in a place and time that demanded everything and offered nothing but the cold comfort of surviving another day to face the same struggles again. Your modern advantages, education, knowledge, even physical fitness from your comfortable life, mean nothing here, might even be disadvantages, because knowing how much better life could be makes enduring how bad it is even harder. Vikings had the advantage of ignorance, of never knowing that existence could be comfortable, warm, safe, and relatively painless. You know what you're missing, which makes every discomfort sharper, every hardship more unbearable, every moment a comparison between what is and what could be, a comparison that Vikings were spared simply by never imagining alternatives to their suffering. The household moves around you, beginning their day with the resigned efficiency of people who've done this thousands of times and will do it thousands more, until injury, illness, or age finally excuses them from the labour that defines existence. You're supposed to join them, to participate, to contribute to the collective survival, but you can't. Your body won't cooperate, your spirit is broken, and you've learned in one brutal day what takes most people a lifetime to fully understand. Survival isn't living, endurance isn't thriving, and making it through another day in Viking Iceland isn't triumph. It's just postponing the inevitable moment when the cold, the hunger, the work, or the sheer accumulated misery finally wins the battle that humans can never ultimately win against a land that tolerates their presence but will never welcome it. So here's the truth, delivered without romance or saga-worthy drama. You wouldn't survive a day in Viking Iceland because you did survive a day barely, and it destroyed you. The Vikings who lived there weren't better or stronger. They were trapped, adapted through necessity rather than choice. And they paid in suffering, shortened lives, and compromised humanity for every moment they managed to continue existing. Their survival wasn't a testament to human greatness, but to human stubbornness. The refusal to give up even when giving up would be the rational choice. The desperate clinging to life, even when life offers little more than the opportunity to suffer until death finally brings relief. The sun, that pathetic, weak excuse for warmth and light, climbs slightly above the horizon, signalling another day of struggle in the land of ice and fire, where Vikings carved out existence through sheer determined suffering. But you're done, finished, unable to continue the fight that they fought daily for their entire lives. You've lasted one day in Viking Iceland, and that one day has taught you everything you need to know. This place, this time, this life would kill you, not quickly through dramatic disaster, but slowly through accumulated misery, grinding you down until there was nothing left but the echo of the person you were before you understood what survival really costs. Underscore 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 underscore. And as the household disperses to their morning tasks, as the smoke rises from the long fire and mingles with the eternal Icelandic wind, as the landscape stretches cold and indifferent toward horizons that promise nothing but more of the same, you understand the final lesson. Viking Iceland doesn't care whether you survive or not. It never did. It simply exists. Harsh and beautiful and absolutely unforgiving. A place where humans managed to live not because they were welcomed, but because they refused to acknowledge how unwelcome they truly were, building their impossible society on volcanic rock and frozen determination, surviving not by conquering the land, but by accepting suffering as the price of existence, enduring until they couldn't anymore, and then being replaced by others equally desperate, equally determined, equally doomed to lives of hardship that make your single day of failure seem almost merciful by comparison. The verdict is final. You wouldn't survive a day in Viking Iceland because survival there wasn't really survival at all. It was just a longer, slower form of dying stretched across years instead of hours, but arriving at the same inevitable end that awaits everyone who tries to make a home in a place that was never meant to be anyone's home at all. Now, the real rest begins, the deepest relaxation, as you let go of all that struggle, all that suffering, all that impossible effort that Vikings somehow sustained across lifetimes. You drift now into the most peaceful sleep, the kind that Vikings never knew, the sleep that comes from knowing you tried, you failed, and you can finally, mercifully, stop trying. The darkness that frightened you last night seems welcoming now, a soft blanket rather than a threat, pulling you down into dreams where there's no cold, no hunger, no labour, no fear, just the gentle recognition that you've done enough, survived enough, suffered enough for one lifetime, even if that lifetime in Viking Iceland lasted barely 24 hours. Sleep now. True sleep, the kind that comes when you've finally surrendered to the impossibility of it all, when you've learned the lesson that Viking Iceland teaches everyone eventually, that survival sometimes means knowing when to let go, when to accept defeat, when to acknowledge that some places, sometimes, some lives are simply beyond what any human should be asked to endure. And in that acceptance, in that surrender, there's a peace that Vikings rarely found, a rest that their harsh existence never quite permitted, a softness that Iceland's volcanic rock and frozen winds could never offer. So sleep, deep and dreamless and forever gentle, learning in rest what you couldn't learn in waking, that sometimes the bravest thing isn't surviving another day but recognizing when you've had enough, when the struggle can end, when the story can finally, peacefully, mercifully fade into the quiet dark where nothing hurts anymore, nothing demands anything, and you can simply be without effort, without pain, without the endless, exhausting work of staying alive in a world that was always too harsh for human hearts to bear. Sweet dreams, tired traveller, you've earned them.